He had every reason to drive past her. She was the woman who had destroyed his town, stolen 3 years of his life, and left an entire community in ruins. Her company's signature was on the letter that shut the factory down. Her decisions had turned fathers into shadows and children into burdens their parents could no longer carry. And now she was hanging off the edge of a cliff, bleeding into the snow, with nobody else coming to save her. Mason Brooks sat behind the wheel of his truck, engine running, wipers fighting the blizzard, and stared at the wreckage. He had maybe 30 seconds to decide. If you've ever had to choose between justice and compassion, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments right now, and let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next inside that cabin will change the way you think about forgiveness forever. The snow had been falling since 2 in the afternoon, but by the time Mason Brooks clocked out of Hardin's Hardware at 8:30, it wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking. He stood under the narrow overhang outside the store's back exit and pulled his jacket zipper all the way to his chin, watching the world dissolve into white. The parking lot lights turned the storm into something almost beautiful, millions of tiny crystals spinning under the orange glow. But Mason had grown up in Crestwood. He knew what mountain snow looked like when it meant business, and this was not the pretty kind. This was the kind that buried cars overnight, the kind that snapped pine branches thick as a man's forearm, the kind that had taken 2 hikers off the Ridgeline Trail back in 2019 and didn't give them back until April. He pulled out his phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough to load anything, but the text from his neighbor Linda had come through 3 hours ago, and he'd read it so many times since then that he had it memorized. Ellie's fine. We made mac and cheese. She keeps going to the window to watch for your truck. Try not to be too late, Mason. This storm looks mean. He typed back, on my way now. 1 hour. Tell her I'm coming. The message spun and spun on the screen, trying to send. He pocketed the phone and walked to his truck. The F-150 was 11 years old and looked every minute of it. The passenger side door had a dent the size of a basketball from when a drunk driver had clipped him in the Kroger parking lot 2 summers back. The rear bumper was held in place with 2 bolts and a kind of optimistic faith. The heater worked, but only if you hit the dashboard panel on the left side with your palm first, and then waited about 90 seconds for it to decide whether it felt like cooperating. Mason climbed in, hit the dash, and waited. The heater coughed to life. "Good boy," he muttered, and pulled out of the lot. Route 9 out of Crestwood into the mountains was 16 miles of 2-lane highway that in summer was the kind of road that made people pull over just to take pictures. Pine trees on both sides, the ridgeline cutting a dramatic silhouette against the sky, the occasional clearing where you could see the valley stretched out like something off a postcard. In winter, it was a different animal entirely. The shoulder disappeared under snow. The center line became a suggestion. The curves that felt gentle at 50 miles an hour in July felt like they were trying to kill you at 35 in February. Mason had driven this road probably 3,000 times in his life. He still gripped the wheel with both hands and leaned forward slightly in his seat, like the extra few inches would help him see better through the whiteout. The radio was playing some country song he didn't know, a woman singing about leaving a small town, and he reached over and turned it off. He needed quiet. He needed to think about the road, and only the road. Ellie would be sitting in Linda's living room with her knees tucked up to her chest, face pressed against the cold glass of the window. He could picture it so clearly it almost hurt. Her dark hair, the little frown she got when she was worried but was trying not to show it, the way she'd press her breath against the window and draw shapes in the fog with her finger while she waited. She was 6 years old and she worried about him constantly. That wasn't right. A 6-year-old shouldn't carry that kind of weight. It was one of those things that gnawed at Mason in the quiet moments. The fact that she'd already learned what it felt like to wait for someone and wonder if they were coming back. She'd learned it the hard way, 3 years ago, when her mother had packed 2 suitcases and driven south and eventually stopped answering the phone. Kids learned the wrong lessons so fast and the right ones so slow. "I'm coming, baby." He said it out loud, to no one, just to hear himself say it. "I'm coming." He was 9 miles up the mountain when he saw the skid marks, or what had been skid marks before the snow covered them. Now they were just 2 shallow grooves in the white, cutting across the left lane and disappearing over the guardrail on the outside edge of the curve. Mason's foot found the brake instinctively, and he slowed to a crawl, leaning forward even more, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The guardrail at the curve's outer edge, a standard issue steel barrier that was supposed to stop a car from going over the cliff, was bent outward at a 45-degree angle. Bent, but not broken, which meant something had hit it hard enough to deform the steel, but not hard enough to punch through completely. Or, said the voice in Mason's head, it hit the rail and bounced, and went over somewhere else. He pulled over to the shoulder, put the truck in park, and left the hazard lights blinking. He grabbed the heavy flashlight he kept under the seat, the serious kind, the kind his father had taught him to always carry in mountain country, and he got out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, not the brisk, refreshing cold of an autumn morning. This was the mean, purposeful cold of a mountain blizzard in February, the kind of cold that had opinions about you and none of them were kind. His breath came out in a thick cloud that the wind immediately shredded apart. He walked to the bent guardrail and shone his flashlight over the edge. About 40 feet below, on a narrow ledge where the cliff face jutted out before dropping another 100 feet to the frozen creek bed below, a black SUV was perched at a terrible angle. The front end was crumpled against the rock face. The rear end hung out over nothing. The vehicle was large, a Range Rover or something similar, and it had clearly rolled at least once on the way down, because the roof was caved in on the driver's side and the passenger windows were gone. Mason stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then the flashlight caught something that made his stomach drop. Movement inside the driver's seat. Faint, barely there, but movement. "Hey!" he shouted into the storm. The wind took his voice and threw it nowhere. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. He looked back at his truck. He looked back down at the SUV. He looked at his phone. No signal at all now, not even 1 bar. He was already calculating the descent before he'd consciously decided to make it. Ota. The cliff face wasn't quite vertical, more of a steep scramble than a true technical climb. But in snow and ice with dress shoes and a work jacket, it was about as fun as it sounded. Mason went down backwards, facing the rock, using his hands to grip at exposed roots and stone outcroppings, testing each foothold before he committed his weight. The flashlight was clenched in his teeth. He'd done this kind of thing as a kid, scrambling around in these mountains with his brother on summer weekends. But that had been daylight and dry rock in youth. He slipped twice. The second time he slid almost 6 feet before a pine sapling growing out of a crack in the rock caught his forearm and held. He hung there for a moment, heart slamming, the flashlight taste of metal in his mouth. Keep going, he kept going. When he reached the ledge, the SUV was bigger and more damaged than it had looked from above. The front axle had crumpled on the driver's side. The hood was folded like a piece of cardboard, and steam or smoke, he couldn't tell which, was still drifting from somewhere under the engine. The smell was gasoline and hot metal, and something sweeter and more chemical that he couldn't identify and didn't want to think about too hard. He got to the driver's side window, what was left of it, and shone the flashlight inside. She was conscious. That was the first thing he registered. Her eyes were open, and they found the light immediately, which meant she was tracking, which meant whatever brain function kept people functional was still working. The second thing he registered was the blood. A cut on her forehead, maybe 3 inches long, running from her hairline toward her left eyebrow. Head wounds bled dramatically even when they weren't deep, and this one had covered the left side of her face in a thin, dark mask that had already begun to dry at the edges. Her airbag had deployed and then deflated, and it hung off the steering wheel like something exhausted. The third thing he registered, and this took about 2 full seconds longer than the first 2 because his brain resisted it, was who she was. He recognized her the way you recognize someone you've seen on television or in a newspaper. Not the casual recognition of a neighbor or an acquaintance, but the specific visceral recognition of someone who had affected your life profoundly from a great distance. Her name was Claire Whitmore. She was the CEO of Whitmore Industrial Group, and 2 years ago, her signature had been on the letter that permanently closed the Crestwood manufacturing plant, eliminated 412 jobs, and effectively kneecapped a town that had been hanging on by its fingernails already. Mason had worked at that plant for 7 years. He stood there in the screaming wind with his flashlight on her blood-covered face for what was probably only 3 or 4 seconds but felt considerably longer, while something complicated and ugly moved through his chest. Then she opened her mouth and said, in a voice that was ragged and thin and nothing like the controlled, precise tone he'd heard in the news clips about the plant closure, "Please." Just that one word, please. The door was jammed. He had to brace both feet against the chassis and pull with everything he had, and even then it only came open about 2/3 of the way, grinding and protesting like it was personally offended by the request. He got his arm inside and found her shoulder. "Can you move?" he asked. "Is anything broken?" "My ankle." She winced as she said it, shifting her weight experimentally and then going very still. "Left ankle. I can't put weight on it." "Okay." He was already looking at the angle of the SUV, the way the rear end was hanging over the ledge. The vehicle wasn't going anywhere immediately. It was resting on the rocky shelf with its center of gravity still roughly in the right place. But he could feel, or thought he could feel, a faint instability in the way it sat, like it was a decision that hadn't been finalized yet. "We need to move fast. The car might go." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something moved across her face. Not recognition, just assessment. The way someone looks at another person when they're trying to figure out if they can be trusted. "I can't put weight on it," she said again. "The ankle. Then you don't." He got his arm around her, finding her waist, and she grabbed onto his jacket with both hands. "On 3, you slide out and I've got you. Don't use the left foot at all. Just dead weight on that side. Lean on me." "What's your name?" she asked. Strange question, he thought, for this exact moment. "Mason. 1, 2. I know who you are. 3. She made a sound when she came out of the seat. Not quite a scream, more compressed than that, like she'd caught it before it could escape and strangled it down to something manageable. And then she was out of the SUV and her full weight was against him, and they were both standing on the icy ledge in the dark, with the cliff above them and the drop below them and the storm making the whole world smaller and smaller. "The cliff," she said, staring up at it. In the dark with the snow, it probably looked like a wall to her. "I've climbed it," he said, which was technically true. "We're going up." "I can't." "You can." Them. It took them 22 minutes to get back up to the road. Mason knew it was 22 minutes because he was watching the time on his watch, the way he'd watch a fuel gauge on empty, obsessively, calculating, trying to figure out how much he had left before something bad happened. He went up first to the extent the pitch allowed, finding the handholds, then reached back down and guided her hands to the right places. She climbed mostly on her arms and her right leg, hauling herself upward while the left ankle hung useless, and every time it accidentally made contact with something she made that compressed, strangled sound again, and kept moving. She didn't cry. He'd been half expecting tears, shock, pain, fear, all of it pointed at him, expecting him to manage her emotions along with everything else. But she didn't cry. She swore, twice, under her breath, in a very undignified way that surprised him, and she bled steadily from the forehead cut, the blood mixing with the snow and running down the side of her face and dripping off her chin. But she climbed. When they finally rolled over the edge onto the road surface and lay there for a moment just breathing, Mason stared up at the black sky and felt something he hadn't expected. Respect. Grudging, complicated, still mixed with resentment respect. He sat up. She was already sitting up, her jaw set, pressing the back of her hand against the forehead cut the way you do when you're not sure whether to apply real pressure or just check how bad it is. She was wearing dress clothes, wool coat, the kind that cost more than his truck payment, dark trousers that were now soaked through and covered in rock dust, one boot on the right foot and nothing on the left, because her ankle had swollen enough that the boot had either fallen off during the crash or during the climb. "Hospital," she said. "There's no getting down the mountain tonight," he told her flatly. "Not in this storm. The road down to Crestwood is going to be buried by now. We'd go off the same cliff in about 3 miles. She stared at him. "Then what?" "There's a ranger cabin." He was already calculating again. "About a mile up the road, then a half mile on a service track. I've used it before, during deer season, a couple years back." "A cabin. It's got a wood stove, probably some supplies. It'll keep us alive until the storm breaks." "Keeps us alive," she repeated, and the way she said it told him she was only now starting to understand the actual situation she was in. "That's what I said." He stood up, and then, without giving himself time to think about whether he wanted to, he extended his hand down to her. She looked at it. She took it. Wham! The walk to the truck was short but ugly. She couldn't put weight on the left foot at all, and the snow was deep enough now that every step with the right foot was uncertain. Mason ended up pulling her arm across his shoulders and taking half her weight, and they moved like that through the blizzard, awkward, slow, mismatched, while the wind did its best to push them both off the road. He got her into the passenger seat, She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she didn't say thank you. He wasn't sure if that was arrogance or shock or just the kind of person she was. He got in on the driver's side, hit the dashboard panel, and waited for the heater. "You have to hit the—" she started. "I know." The heater came on. He drove. The service track to the ranger cabin was almost invisible under the snow, but Mason had the muscle memory of the turn. Third dirt road past the milepost marker with the bullet holes in it, and he made it without too much trouble. The track itself was rough in summer and nightmarish in a blizzard, but the F-150 was built for exactly this kind of thing, and he kept the speed down and the four-wheel drive engaged, and they made it through in about 10 minutes. The cabin appeared in the headlights like something from a different century. It was small, one room, maybe 16 by 20 feet, built from logs that had been there long enough to go dark brown and moss-covered. There was a covered porch with a woodpile stacked against the wall, which was the most important thing. A propane lantern hung by the door, boards on the windows, which he'd have to pull to let in light, but that was tomorrow's problem. "It's not much," he said. She looked at it through the windshield. "It has walls." "It has walls," he agreed. He'd been in the cabin before, but not in winter, and the cold inside was the specific heavy cold of a space that has been shut up for months. His breath came out in great clouds as he moved around in the dark with the flashlight, finding the wood stove, finding the lantern, and checking the fuel, finding the supply shelf beside the door where the ranger service kept emergency basics. Canned beans, a half-empty box of crackers, 2 bottles of water, frozen solid, a box of matches, a first aid kit with a Red Cross logo so faded it was almost white. Not much, not nothing. He got the wood stove going. It took 3 tries with the damp matches and a great deal of patience, while Claire sat on the one wooden chair and said nothing. In the growing firelight, he could see her more clearly, and she looked worse than she had outside. The forehead cut had stopped bleeding but had dried into a mess. Her face was pale in a way that was beyond cold. She was shaking. "Hypothermia starts fast when you're wet," he said, without looking at her. "I'm aware of what hypothermia is. Then you should take the wet coat off." A pause. "There's nothing else to wear." He went to the cot in the corner and checked the blankets. Heavy wool, the kind that never really felt clean but never actually let you down either, and brought them over. "Coat off, wrap in these. Your core temperature matters more than your modesty right now." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then she peeled off the ruined wool coat and wrapped the blankets around her shoulders. He noticed she did it efficiently, without fumbling, without drama, folding the coat and setting it on the floor beside the chair like she was in a hotel room and would need it again in the morning. He found the first aid kit and brought it over. "The forehead needs to be cleaned. I can do it myself." "You can't see it." Another pause, then, "Fine." He pulled the chair closer to the stove where the light was better and crouched down so they were roughly eye level. She sat very still while he cleaned the cut with the antiseptic wipe from the kit. She didn't flinch, which again surprised him, and closed it with the 3 butterfly strips that were in there. This close, she looked younger than she did in photographs. Or maybe photographs always made people look more certain than they were. "It's not deep enough for stitches," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Good. How's the ankle?" "Hurts." "Can you rotate it?" She tried. Her jaw tightened. "Somewhat." "Probably not broken then. Badly sprained." "Probably." She looked at him directly for the first time since they'd been in real light. Her eyes were dark, and they were doing that assessment thing again, taking him apart and putting him back together. "You said you know who I am." "Yeah." "How?" He stood up and walked back to the stove to add another piece of wood, buying himself a moment. "I worked at the Crestwood plant for 7 years," he said, keeping his voice level. "You were on the news when it closed. Hard to forget a face attached to that kind of news." The silence that followed had weight to it. "I see," she said finally. "Do you?" That was a business decision. Her voice was careful, practiced, the kind of careful that comes from having said the same thing many times to many people in many difficult rooms. "The facility was operating at a loss, I know. I heard the press conference." He set the wood down and looked at her. 412 people, Ms. Whitmore. That was the number. I knew most of them. I watched what happened to them after. He shook his head. "But that's not a conversation for tonight." "Then why mention it?" "Because you asked if I knew who you were. I wanted you to know that I do." He picked up the second blanket and tossed it to her. "And I still brought you in out of the storm, so you know where we stand." She caught the blanket. For a moment, something moved behind her eyes. Not quite guilt, not quite surprise, something that didn't have a clean name. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. Not the reflexive social kind of thanks. The other kind. He nodded once and went back to feeding the stove. By 11 o'clock, the storm had reached what Mason's father would have called its full voice. The wind was constant and mean, driving the snow sideways against the cabin walls with a sound like static. The logs creaked. The stove worked hard and barely kept up, holding the cabin at what Mason estimated was about 45 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, warm enough that core hypothermia was no longer the immediate threat. He'd moved the chair closer to the stove and dragged the cot over to the opposite wall, setting up a rough division of space that he thought might make her more comfortable. She had said very little since the exchange about the factory. She sat in the chair with the blankets around her, her left ankle propped on the edge of the cot, watching the stove the way people watch fire when they're thinking about something they don't want to say out loud. Mason sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees up, eating crackers from the box and trying not to think about Ellie. That was the hardest part. Not the cold, not the situation, not even the strange charged company he was in. It was the image of his daughter at Linda's window, waiting, and the certainty that by now she knew something was wrong because he always called when he was going to be late, and he hadn't called and he couldn't call. And Linda would be telling her it was fine, and the storm was just bad, and Daddy would call as soon as the signal came back, and Ellie would nod and say, "Okay," and go back to the window. "You mentioned a daughter," Claire said. He looked up. "When?" "When we were on the cliff. You said I have to get back to my daughter. You said it under your breath. I think you thought I couldn't hear you." He didn't remember saying it. "She's 6. She's at my neighbor's." "What's her name?" "Ellie." Claire nodded slowly. "She's waiting for you." "She is? Then I'm sorry." She said it to the stove, not to him. "For being here. For being the reason you're not back with her right now." Mason turned that over for a moment. "You didn't drive yourself off a cliff on purpose." "No." "Then don't apologize for the storm." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to a real smile, but something shifted at the corner of her mouth. "You have a very literal way of thinking." "I work in hardware." This time the smile was real, and it surprised both of them and disappeared quickly. The fire snapped and popped. Outside, the mountain continued making its opinions known. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "You can ask." "When you saw me in that car, when you recognized me, what did you think? Your first thought? The actual one, not the polite version." He was quiet for a moment, then he said that the universe had a dark sense of humor. She looked at him. "And then?" "And then I saw you moving and I thought about what I'd want someone to do if it was me down there." He pulled his knees closer to his chest. That was pretty much the whole decision. She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to respond at all. Then she said, almost to herself, "That's simple." "Most things are," he said. "It's just that most things come with a lot of noise around them, making them seem complicated." She turned her head and looked at him properly. "How long have you been a philosopher?" "Since about the 3rd year after the plant closed and I had to figure out what to do with myself." Something flickered across her face at that. Not guilt, or not just guilt, something more uncomfortable. The kind of discomfort that comes from information making its way somewhere you'd rather it didn't go. "What did you do?" she asked. "After. Hardware store." "That's not what I mean." He knew it wasn't. "I figured out how to be somebody's father without the salary I thought I needed to do it right. That took about a year." He ate another cracker. "I figured out that the people in this town were going to be okay because they'd been okay before, and they had each other, even if they had less money. That took another year." He paused. "I figured out that being angry at you specifically was a waste of my specific energy, because you didn't know us and we were a line item to you, and being angry at a line item is like being angry at the weather." The last sentence came out more tired than bitter, which was the truth of it. Claire was very still. "And now?" she said quietly. "Now that you know I'm not a weather system." "Now," he said slowly, I'm sitting in a cabin in a blizzard with you, and we're both going to be here until morning at least. So I guess now is when I find out whether you're worth the reconsideration." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the fire. "That's fair," she said. Around midnight, Mason made the beans. It was an unglamorous production. Can opener from the first aid kit's unlikely contents, pot he found hung on a nail above the stove, beans heated until they were warm but not hot because he didn't want to burn them and waste the only real food they had. He gave her the larger portion without making a thing of it, and she ate without commenting on the portion size, which he respected. They ate in something that wasn't quite comfortable silence but wasn't hostile either. The middle territory. The silence of people who have decided to stop circling each other and haven't yet figured out what comes next. "The press conference," she said when she'd put down the bowl, "after the closure announcement. You watched it." Most of the town did. "What did you think of what I said?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without it turning into an argument. "I thought you believed it," he said finally. "That was the worst part. You weren't lying. You genuinely believed that the language you were using, restructuring, repositioning, strategic reallocation, you believed that those words meant something real and complete. Like a translation that gets all the vocabulary right but loses every feeling in the original." She was quiet for so long he thought he'd said too much. Pushed too hard. Then, "I was 28 when I made that decision." He hadn't known that. He'd assumed she was older. The title, the news coverage, the composure that read as the confidence of a woman in her mid-30s at least. "I'd been CEO for 11 months, she continued. "The board gave me the numbers. The plant was losing money. The alternative they put in front of me was closure or bankruptcy of the entire company, which would have meant 5 times as many jobs lost across all our facilities." She paused. "I believed that. I still believe it was arithmetically true." "Arithmetic," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "And I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone who was 28 and new and scared and made the call she thought she had to make." Something shifted in her expression, like she'd been braced for something harder. "That doesn't mean it wasn't wrong," he added. "It can be both." "Both," she repeated softly. "Yeah." He stood and collected the bowls and put them by the door, away from the fire, because the smell would get bad if he left them near the heat. You can understand why a decision happened and still know it caused damage. Those two things don't cancel each other out. She was watching him when he turned back around. "You're more nuanced than I expected," she said. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Anger? I told you. I got over the anger. That's almost more unsettling somehow." He sat back down on the floor. "Good. Keeps things interesting." The temperature dropped again around 2 in the morning. He felt it in the way the cabin's cold corners asserted themselves more aggressively, the way the stove's warmth seemed to reach less far, even though he kept feeding it. He checked the woodpile, still had maybe 4 hours worth, which should be enough to get them to dawn, but he'd need to be careful. He was adding a log when she said, "Mason." Her voice was different, smaller. He turned around. She was still in the chair, but something about her posture had changed. She was shaking more noticeably, the blankets pulled tighter, and her color was wrong. The pallor of cold that had been manageable all evening had shifted to something grayer, something with less energy in it. "I'm cold," she said, which, from someone who had spent the entire night composing herself carefully, was as close to an admission of serious distress as she seemed capable of making. He crossed the room in 3 steps, crouching in front of her and putting the back of his hand against her neck. Her skin was cold in a way that was past simple cold, the clamminess of a body that was starting to redirect its resources inward. "How long have you been this cold?" he asked. "It got worse in the last hour. You should have said something an hour ago." "I didn't want to—" She stopped. "I didn't want to be a problem." He looked at her for a moment. The CEO of a billion-dollar company, in a broken-down cabin in a blizzard, worried about being a problem. "Okay," he said, "here's what we're going to do." The cot was narrow. It was a ranger's emergency cot, not built for luxury. But it was wide enough for 2 people if neither of them had any particular attachment to personal space. He moved it directly in front of the stove, close enough that the heat hit the side of it directly. He doubled the blankets over it. "I need to be next to you," he said. "Body heat. That's not— I want to be clear, that's what this is." She looked at the cot and then at him. Her jaw was set, He was fairly certain her teeth would have been chattering if she were allowing them to. "I know what it is," she said. "Okay." Getting her from the chair to the cot was uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. The logistics of her ankle, the closeness required to move her, the specific strangeness of helping someone physically who you're also still partly furious at on behalf of 412 people. But he managed it. She managed it. They ended up on the cot with the blankets over both of them and the stove throwing its heat at them from 2 feet away. She was rigid with cold and something that wasn't just cold. Discomfort, maybe. The particular discomfort of someone who controlled everything and currently controlled nothing. "You can relax," he said. "I'm not going to—" "I know," she said, quick, certain. "Okay." They lay in silence while the stove worked and the blizzard continued its opinions, and the cabin's old timbers groaned under the weight of accumulated snow on the roof. Her shaking gradually, very gradually, began to ease. The clamminess started to give way to something warmer. After a while, he didn't know how long, she said, "Tell me about Ellie." "What?" "Tell me about her. Your daughter." Her voice was quieter now, less defended. The voice she'd been keeping at a distance all evening had gotten shorter on fuel. "I want to hear about something that isn't this storm." So he told her. He told her about the time Ellie had decided she was going to learn to cook, and had made him a birthday cake that was somehow simultaneously burned and raw, and how he had eaten an entire slice while keeping his face completely neutral, and how she had watched him eat it with the most serious and hopeful expression he'd ever seen on a human being. He told her about this phase Ellie had gone through where she refused to answer to her own name and insisted on being called Captain Starbeam for 6 weeks. He told her about the drawings Ellie did, dense, complex drawings full of unlikely animals and elaborate scenarios, and how he'd wallpapered an entire wall of the hallway with them. He told her about the morning he'd been so tired and broke and beaten down that he'd sat on the kitchen floor and cried while Ellie was asleep, and how Ellie had appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, looked at him seriously, gone away, and come back with a juice box and set it on the floor next to him without a word. 6 years old, Claire said softly. 6 years old. She sounds like someone with a very old soul. She's the best person I know. He said it simply, without embellishment, because it was simply true. She makes me want to be a better version of myself every single day. I don't always get there, but I want to. Silence. The warmth between them had found a kind of equilibrium now. The body generated heat holding steady under the blankets. "I don't have that," Claire said. Not with self-pity, just saying a thing. "A child? Anything that makes me want to be better. Anything that reminds me why." She paused. "I have quarterly targets that remind me I need to perform. That's not the same thing." "No," he said, "it's not." "When did you last feel like your life was going in the right direction?" He thought about it honestly. A few months ago, Ellie's school had a winter concert, and she was in the second row, and she found me in the crowd about 30 seconds in, and she lit up, like somebody turned a lamp on inside her. He paused. "I thought, I'm doing okay. I'm not doing it the way I planned, but I'm doing okay." "That's enough," Claire said quietly. "That's actually enough to build on." "What about you?" he asked. "When did you last feel like that?" The silence that followed was longer than any of the others that night. "I'm trying to remember," she said. Outside, the mountain made its sounds. The fire made its sounds. And in the cabin that was barely keeping the winter out, 2 people who should have had nothing to say to each other found that, stripped of everything else, they had more in common than either of them was prepared for. That was when Mason understood that this night was going to matter. He didn't know in what way yet. He didn't know what it would mean when the storm broke and the road was clear and they went back to their separate, incompatible lives. He didn't try to calculate it or contain it. He just lay there in the firelight and let it be what it was. And that, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, felt like enough. The storm outside hit its peak somewhere around 4 in the morning and began, slowly, grudgingly, to pull its worst punches. Inside the cabin, the fire burned. The 2 people it sheltered slept, finally, in the fitful and imperfect way of people who have more to think about than sleep will accommodate. But they slept. The mountain had made its decision. Now they would have to make theirs. Mason woke before dawn to the sound of the wind doing something different, not quieter. The storm was still working, still throwing itself against the cabin walls with a kind of mindless persistence. But the pitch had changed. Less screaming, more grinding. The difference between a thing that was trying to destroy everything in its path and a thing that was simply tired and continuing out of habit. He'd grown up reading Mountain Weather the way other kids read comic books, and what his body told him in that half second between sleep and waking was, still bad, but the worst is behind it. He was on his back with one arm bent under his head and the blanket pulled to his chin, and for a moment he just lay there doing an inventory of himself. Cold feet. The cabin had bled heat in the small hours and the stove had burned down to coals. Stiff neck from the cot's thin mattress, which had roughly the cushioning of a yoga mat with ambitions. His jacket was still on, which he was glad of. Then he registered the weight against his left side and remembered all at once where he was and why. Claire was still asleep. She'd shifted in the night, turned away from the stove and toward him, which made the kind of pragmatic animal sense that sleeping bodies understand even when waking minds would have complicated it. Her shoulder was against his arm. Her breathing was slow and even in a way it hadn't been for most of the previous night, when every hour or so he'd felt the faint shudder of her body recalibrating against the cold. He stayed still for a moment, not wanting to wake her. She looked different asleep. He was aware that was a cliché. People always look different asleep, but what he meant was specific. Awake, even in pain and shock and in the stripped-down circumstances of the cabin, there had been something operational about her. Some part of her mind that was always running the numbers, always tracking exits and options, always composing the next sentence before the current one finished landing. Asleep, that was gone. What was left was just a person who'd gone over a cliff and bled and climbed a rock face on a bad ankle and eaten cold beans and talked honestly in the dark, and was now sleeping with her forehead almost touching his shoulder like she'd known him longer than 12 hours. He eased off the cot slowly, careful not to shift the mattress too much, and went to deal with the stove. The coals were still alive, orange under their gray layer, just needing encouragement. He added the smallest pieces from the woodpile to catch first, then waited, crouching in front of the open stove door with his hands extended. The fire rebuilt itself with the gradual confidence of something that knew it had all the time it needed. When he was satisfied it would hold, he added 2 larger pieces and closed the door. He stood up and looked out through the crack at the edge of one of the boarded windows. Pre-dawn gray. Snow still coming, but lighter. The difference between a bedsheet and a curtain. The trees were buried to their lower branches. The service road was invisible, just a suggestion of flatness between 2 walls of white. The truck was a white mound in the clearing. It was beautiful, in the way that dangerous things are sometimes beautiful. He'd never been able to help noticing that. He heard her shift on the cot behind him. "What time is it?" Her voice was rough with sleep, stripped of its usual precision. "Around 5:30, I think." He turned. She'd pushed up to sitting and was running a hand through her hair, which had come mostly loose from whatever it had been in the day before, and was now doing what hair does when it has survived a car crash and a night in a mountain cabin. "How's the ankle?" She looked down at her left foot, extended it slightly, tried a rotation. Her jaw tightened. "Worse than last night." "That's normal for a sprain. Inflammation peaks overnight." She looked up at him. "How do you know that?" "I have a 6-year-old. I know more about injuries than I ever wanted to." He went to the supply shelf and found the first aid kit again, dug through it. There was a single-use cold pack, the kind you squeeze to activate, and he brought it over, crouched in front of her, and pressed it against her ankle. "That's going to be cold," she said. "That's the idea." She pressed her lips together but didn't pull away. He looked at the ankle properly in the growing firelight. It was swollen and bruised a deep yellow purple, and the skin was tight over the joint in a way that meant significant fluid. Still, it had the shape of a sprained ankle rather than the wrong shape of a broken one, which was something. "You should keep this elevated when you're not moving," he said. "And when I am moving?" "You're not moving today." He looked up at her. "The road down won't be passable until they plow it, and that's not happening until the storm clears, which probably means afternoon at the earliest." She took that in. He watched her process it. The slight tightening around the eyes, the adjustment of whatever internal schedule she'd been running. "I have a board meeting on Thursday," she said. "It's Tuesday." "I know what day it is." "Then you know Thursday is 2 days away and we'll be out of here well before that." She looked at him like she was trying to decide whether to argue the point, and then decided it wasn't worth it. "Fine." "Fine," he agreed. He went back to the woodpile and found a flat piece of split log that would do as a prop and brought it back to slide under her foot. She watched this whole operation with an expression he was getting better at reading. The look of someone who was not accustomed to receiving practical care and didn't entirely know what to do with it. "Do you want water?" he asked. "The bottles will have thawed enough." "Yes, please." He brought them both bottles and sat back down on the floor with his back against the wall, and they drank in the quiet of the early morning while the fire got back to work and the storm outside continued its wind down. It was almost domestic. That was the strange part. The two of them in the firelight drinking water, not talking yet, each in the process of waking up into the reality of another day of this. It had the tired, companionable feeling of people who had passed through something together and come out the other side slightly less defended than they'd been when it started. "Can I ask you something?" Mason said. "You asked me that last night." "And you answered. Then I suppose I'll answer again." She wrapped both hands around the water bottle. "Go ahead." "The ankle, the forehead." He nodded at her. "You're not complaining, not at all. Most people would be." "Most people?" The average person trapped in a cabin with injuries would be communicating their discomfort pretty regularly. She was quiet for a moment, then, "My father had a saying. He used it constantly when I was growing up, and I spent most of my 20s thinking it was toxic and harmful, and now I'm 30, and I think he was mostly right." "What was the saying?" "The world won't adjust itself to your pain, so don't lead with it." She turned the water bottle in her hands. He wasn't a warm man, but he wasn't entirely wrong. "He sounds like he was hard to grow up with." He was. She said it without drama. "He was also the person who told me I could run a company when I was 12 years old, and every teacher I had thought I was too intense for normal social function." A pause. "He was complicated. Most people are." "Is your father complicated?" Mason looked at the stove. "He died when I was 22, fishing accident on the river. So I got the simplified version. Whatever I'd already collected of him is all I have." "I'm sorry. He was a straightforward man. I don't think he'd have been complicated even if he'd lived longer." He half smiled. He would have just kept being straightforward in new situations. "That sounds like a kind of gift?" "It was." He paused. He would have hated the plant closing, but he would have had a plan for what to do next before he'd finished being angry about it. That was how he operated. "Did you have a plan?" Eventually, he rolled the water bottle between his palms. "Not at first. First, I had about 3 months of feeling like the floor had gone out from under everything, because the plan I'd had, steady work, save enough, build something for Ellie, that was built on the factory job. When the job went, I had to figure out if it was just the plan that was gone, or something more than that." She was watching him with the full attention she'd been rationing the night before. "Which was it?" she asked. "Just the plan," he said. "That took some time to figure out, but it was just the plan." He looked at her. "How often do you check your company's finances?" The shift in topic made her blink. "Daily. Sometimes more than once." "How often do you check your own?" She didn't answer right away. Her hand stilled on the bottle. "Not the company's performance," he clarified. "Yours. What you have. What you actually need." "Those aren't the same thing?" "I don't think they are." "No." She looked at the fire. The silence that followed was the thinking kind, not the uncomfortable kind. "I haven't done that in a while," she said eventually, and then quieter. "I'm not sure I'd know what I was looking at." Morning arrived slowly, the gray light at the window edges turning incrementally from charcoal to pewter to something close to white. The snow had thinned to a genuinely gentle fall by 7 o'clock. Still cold, still difficult, but no longer the kind of thing that felt like a personal vendetta. Mason pried one of the window boards loose from the inside and let the pale winter light into the cabin properly for the first time. It changed everything. The firelight had made the space feel compressed and urgent. Daylight opened it up, made it ordinary, made it just a small room with 2 people in it. He made the last of the crackers into a kind of meal by eating them slowly, with discipline, and dividing them equally. They had no more canned food, the beans had been the last of it. So this was breakfast and probably lunch unless the storm cleared faster than expected and he could get to the truck. She ate without commenting on the inadequacy of the food, which he was coming to understand was her particular brand of toughness. She wouldn't complain about the things she couldn't change. That didn't mean she was okay with them. He could see the calculation in her face, the awareness of the limits of the situation. But she didn't use words for what couldn't be fixed. Tell me about Crestwood, she said. He looked up from his crackers. What about it? Everything. The town. What it was like before the plant closed. What it's like now. She held his gaze. I want to actually know. Something in the way she said it, the directness of it, the absence of the corporate buffer she'd been maintaining intermittently since the previous night, made him take it seriously rather than deflect it. So he told her. He told her about this Crestwood of his childhood, the plant running 3 shifts, the main street with actual stores in it, the summer festivals where half the county came through, and the kids stayed out until 9 on school nights because the evenings were long and safe and everyone knew everyone. He told her about the plant in his own years there, the culture of it, the men he'd worked with, guys like Dennis Okafor, who'd been there 23 years and knew every machine on the floor by sound, could tell you from 50 feet away if a press was running a half degree out of calibration. Guys like Pete Solano, who ran the receiving dock and organized the softball league every summer, and whose wife made tamales that showed up on the break room table every December. He told her what those people looked like in the year after the closure. Not suddenly, dramatically broken, but the slower, grayer erosion of people whose organizing structure had been removed. Dennis had moved to his daughter's house in Cincinnati because he couldn't find work. Pete had stayed and was driving a delivery truck for a company 3 towns over and looked 10 years older than he was. The town didn't die, Mason said. That's the thing people get wrong when they talk about these places. It didn't die. It just got smaller and older and more tired, and the people who were 25 when the plant closed mostly aren't there anymore, because when you're 25 you go to where the work is. So what's left is the people who are too rooted to leave, which mostly means older and which means the town keeps aging without anyone coming in young enough to change the direction. Claire had been listening through all of this without interrupting, without her face doing the things faces do when people are waiting for their turn to talk. She was actually listening. The hardware store, she said. That's where you work. Harden's. Yeah, Bill Harden's had it 30 years. He'd have closed it 2 years ago, except his wife talked him out of it. And honestly, the fact that it's still open is partly stubbornness, and partly the fact that there's nowhere else within 20 miles to get a specific bolt in an emergency. Is it enough? The job? He looked at her steadily. It pays the rent and keeps Ellie fed and clothed. So by the definition that actually matters, yes. She absorbed that. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. He set down the last of his crackers. You meant, am I okay being someone who used to operate industrial machinery and now runs a cash register? And the honest answer is that it took a while before the answer was yes. There was a version of me about 1.5 years after the closure who was not great company. Angry at things I couldn't name specifically, taking too long to get out of bed on days I didn't have to be somewhere. He paused. Ellie was what pulled me through that. Not in some dramatic way. Just the daily fact of her needing me to show up. That's hard to argue with. You're lucky to have her, Claire said. I know. No, I mean... She stopped, reconsidered. I mean that most people don't have something that specific pulling them. Most people have the abstract pull of being needed in general, which is diffuse enough that you can ignore it on the bad days. She looked down at her hands. Something that specific is rare. He studied her for a moment. There was something in her voice that was harder to look at in daylight than it had been in firelight. The previous night, the darkness had given her a kind of permission to be honest. In the morning light, the same honesty looked more exposed. What do you have? He asked. She didn't answer right away. The company, she said finally. That's a what, not a who. Yes, a beat. I'm aware. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell softer. Is there someone? He asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. It seemed relevant to the shape of her life as she was describing it. There was. For about 2 years. He was in finance, worked in the same building, very, she searched for the word, coordinated. We worked well together in the practical sense, same schedule, similar priorities, comfortable understanding of each other's time limitations. That sounds like a business arrangement. It probably was. She said it without bitterness, which was almost worse. It ended about 8 months ago, and neither of us was particularly surprised. We had dinner the night he moved out of my apartment, and we were polite and rational and agreed on the logistics, and that was that. She looked at the fire. I remember thinking, this should feel like more than this, but it didn't. Did you miss him? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. I missed having a person in the apartment. I'm not sure I specifically missed him. A pause. That's a terrible thing to say about someone. It's an honest thing. Honesty and terrible can coexist. That's true, he said. It's also a sign that you knew the relationship wasn't what it looked like. She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Something that's real leaves a specific hole when it goes. Not a general missing a person feeling, but a particular jagged, specific loss. The shape of it tells you what you had. He picked up a piece of wood and turned it in his hands without adding it to the stove yet. If the shape is just, I miss having someone around, then it wasn't that particular, she finished, quietly. Yeah, she looked at him. Have you had that? The specific kind. He was quiet for a moment. Ellie's mother. I'm sorry. Don't be. She left because she was unhappy, and she stayed unhappy wherever she went, and that's not my burden to carry anymore. He put the wood on the fire. But yeah, when she left, it wasn't general. It was specific as a knife in a specific place, so I know the difference. He closed the stove door. And I know it's worth looking for. Claire was watching him with an expression he didn't try to read. You're a surprising man, Mason Brooks, she said. People keep expecting simple and getting complicated, he said. It's kind of a theme, but... By mid-morning, the storm had quieted enough that Mason ventured outside to check the truck and the road. He put his jacket back on and braced himself at the cabin door and then stepped out into a world that was white and still, and so cold it hurt the inside of his nose with each breath. The truck was buried to the running boards. Diggable, but he'd need time. The service road was completely snowed over, but the outline of it was visible. 2 gentle rises where the trees stood on either side of the flat track. He walked about 50 yards down it, testing the depth, watching how the snow behaved underfoot. Deep, but not the structural packed kind. The kind a truck with 4-wheel drive could push through if the driver committed to it. He looked down the mountain toward where Route 9 would be. Still wrong. Still the particular blankness of a road that wasn't going anywhere yet. But the sky to the west had that thin, watery quality that sometimes meant the engine of a storm was running out of fuel. He'd seen that sky before. He knew what it usually promised. Afternoon, he told himself. Maybe 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. The plows would come through. The road would open. He went back inside. Noon, maybe afternoon, he told her. We're not stuck for another night. Something crossed her face that he almost would have called disappointment. It was brief and she corrected for it immediately, and he chose not to comment on it. Good, she said. He sat back down. The cabin felt different in the late morning, the sunlight actually making it through the window gap now, a shaft of white winter light cutting across the floor between them. It was the kind of light that made everything more real and more ordinary, and also the kind that had a way of making people look at things they'd been comfortable leaving in the dark. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is that you don't want to answer. Okay? When you look at this town, Crestwood, the way it is now, do you think it can come back? Or is it the kind of place that keeps declining until there's nothing left? He looked at her. The question had the shape of more than curiosity. That depends, he said carefully, on what comes along that's worth building around. The factory, she said, if someone were to open a manufacturing facility, new equipment, different model, sustainable production, would the people still be there? Is there enough of a workforce? Some of the people who left came back when their situations elsewhere didn't work out, he said slowly. Some of the older workers are still there and still have their skills. The infrastructure is still standing. The old plant building is still there. It hasn't been demolished. He was watching her face now. Where is this coming from? She held his gaze. There was something careful in the way she was sitting, a degree of intention he hadn't seen all morning, as if she'd been assembling something quietly and was only now deciding whether to show it. I've been thinking about it, she said. Crestwood, the numbers looked different 2 years ago. Or I let them look different. I took what the board gave me, and I didn't ask the right questions about what recovery looked like. She paused. I've had some time to think recently. Sitting in a burning car will do that. It wasn't burning. It felt like it was. A beat. What I'm saying is, I've been rethinking the decision, not just the ethics of it, but the economics. The region has changed. There are incentives available now that weren't 2 years ago. The manufacturing sector in this part of the state is actually in a position where a facility like the old plant could be viable again if it were restructured correctly. He was quiet. The shaft of sunlight lay between them. "You're telling me this because," he started. "I'm telling you this because I've been sitting in this cabin since last night listening to you describe what my decisions cost real people, and I want you to know that it's actually in here." She touched her chest, briefly, like she wasn't used to the gesture. "Not as a liability on a balance sheet, as an actual thing I'm responsible for." He looked at her for a long time. "And?" he said. "And I want to do something about it." She held his gaze steadily. "That's as far as I've gotten. I don't have a plan yet. I'm telling you the intention because—" She stopped, rearranged. "Because you were honest with me last night and this morning, and I think you deserve to know where my head is." He didn't say anything right away. He was sorting through several different reactions. The skeptical one, the one that wanted to protect the remaining residents of Crestwood from a promise that might evaporate when she got back to her board meetings and her skyscrapers and the real economics of the decision. The one that noticed she was telling him this now, in this cabin, before she was back in her world, and it would have been easy enough to just not. "How real is it?" he said. "Not the intention, the feasibility." "Real enough that I started running numbers in my head at about 3 in the morning and couldn't stop." She looked almost annoyed about it. "It's not a guaranteed proposition. There are significant obstacles, but it's not a fantasy either. If you do it," he said, "and I mean if it needs to be done right, not in a way that looks good in a press release. Actual good wages, actual job security, actual respect for the fact that the people who would work there have already been burned once, and they won't forgive twice. I know that. I need you to really know it. Not know it as a talking point, know it." She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who had just been spoken to like a human being rather than a title, and was deciding to respond in kind. "That's why I'm telling you," she said, "because you'd call it out if it wasn't real, and I need someone to call it out." "I'm nobody," he said. "I'm a guy who works in a hardware store." "You are not nobody." She said it with a flatness that made it a fact rather than a compliment. "You're someone who has been paying attention to this town and these people for years. You know things I can't find in a data report." He sat back. Outside, somewhere up the mountain, something shifted. The sound of the wind changing again, moving through a higher register. He looked at the window and saw the sunlight had gotten stronger and wider. The kind of clear that comes when weather systems finally pull apart and let the sky breathe. "The road will open this afternoon," he said again. "I heard you the first time." He stopped. She was looking at him. The assessment was still there, but something else had layered in behind it. Something warmer and less certain and more honest than assessment. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it will." They sat in the morning light and the fire's warmth and the strange, specific gravity of a situation that had started as a car crash and a blizzard and had become, somewhere in the long hours between midnight and now, something neither of them had vocabulary ready for. Mason looked at his watch. 10:47. He thought about Ellie at Linda's window. He thought about what Claire had said, "You are not nobody," and felt something shift in his chest, small and resistant, the way a stone shifts when the ground underneath it has been moved by water. He didn't examine it, not yet. He got up and added wood to the fire, because whatever happened next, the cabin still needed to stay warm, and that was something he knew how to do. The sky outside was doing what mountain skies do after a serious storm, performing a kind of aggressive innocence. The blue so sharp and clean it looked manufactured, the snow on the trees catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in 1,000 small directions. It was the kind of beautiful that didn't care what it had cost. Mason had spent most of late morning digging out the truck. He'd found a flat piece of board leaning against the cabin's back wall, left there by some ranger or hunter with the practical foresight of someone who understood mountain winters. And he'd used it as a rough shovel, clearing the snow from around the tires and the running boards, and the hood in long, heavy strokes that warmed him despite the cold. It was the kind of physical work he was good at, the kind that required nothing from his mind, just his back and his arms and his attention to the task directly in front of him, and he found himself grateful for it. The cabin had been getting smaller all morning, not because anything bad was happening in it, but because things were happening in it that he didn't know what to do with. And when Mason Brooks didn't know what to do with something, his instinct was to go find something physical to accomplish. He'd checked the road twice. The first time, around 11, it was still unpassable. The snow on Route 9 sat in a long, unbroken, 2-foot-deep silence that said clearly, "Not yet." The second time, around 1 in the afternoon, something had changed. The surface had a different quality, a slightly compressed look, and there were tire tracks at the far edge where the road curved away down the mountain. Not a plow. The tracks were too narrow, but someone had come through, which meant the lower section was passable, which meant eventually the plow would come up from town, and when it did, they could move. He went back into the cabin. Claire was where he'd left her, except she'd managed to work her way from the cot to the chair by the stove, using the wall for support, and she'd found the cabin's one other functional object, a deck of cards, old and soft with use, in a worn box on the shelf above the woodpile, and was laying out a solitaire game on the floor in front of her. Her left foot was propped on the edge of the cot. The cold pack had long since warmed through, and she'd set it aside. "Road's opening up," he said. "I heard you scraping." She moved a card without looking up. Sounded therapeutic. It was. He sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and watched her play for a minute. She played solitaire the same way she did everything, with focus, without wasted motion, assessing each move before she made it. He noticed she didn't cheat, even when cheating would have obviously moved the game along. Some people flipped cards over when they were stuck, gave themselves little allowances. She didn't. "You're going to lose that one," he said after a moment. "I know. The 7 of hearts needs to go on the 8 of spades, but the 8 of spades is buried." "I know that too." She turned another card. "Doesn't stop me from playing it out." "What's the point of playing it out if you already know how it ends?" She looked up at him then. The sunlight from the window caught the side of her face, and the dried remnant of the forehead cut was visible, dark against her temple. The butterfly strip still holding, but the bruising around it had spread and deepened into a mottled purple yellow. She'd managed to put her hair back in some functional way with a rubber band she'd found somewhere, and she was wearing his jacket over her own. He'd given it to her 2 hours ago because she'd been shivering and hadn't said anything about it, and she'd taken it without the expected argument, which meant she'd been colder than she was letting on. "Because losing with full information is different from losing with incomplete information," she said. "When you lose with full information, you have no one to blame but the game itself." That is an extremely specific philosophy for solitaire. It's the same philosophy I use for business decisions. She turned another card. "When everything falls apart, I want to be able to say I saw the constraints clearly and worked within them and still lost rather than pretend I didn't know the cards were buried." He thought about that for a moment. "Doesn't that get exhausting, seeing every constraint clearly?" "Constantly." She said it without self-pity, the way you'd describe the weather. "But the alternative is self-deception, and self-deception has a much worse yield." He looked at the scattered cards. "Did you see the constraints clearly when you decided to close the plant?" It was a direct question, and it landed directly. She didn't flinch from it. She set down the card in her hand and looked at the layout in front of her. "I saw the financial constraints clearly," she said. "I had very clear information about the numbers." She paused. "What I didn't see, or didn't make myself see, was the downstream cost, the human arithmetic." She picked the card back up. "And I think the reason I didn't is that the people presenting me the information didn't include it, and I was young enough and new enough and scared enough of looking weak that I didn't ask for it." "You were scared," he said. Not as an accusation, just taking the word she'd used and looking at it. "Terrified," she said. It came out quietly, and it had the sound of something she hadn't said out loud to many people. 11 months in the chair, I still didn't fully believe I was supposed to be there. And when the board hands you a crisis and everyone in the room is watching to see how you handle it," she shook her head. "I handled it the way I thought a CEO should handle it. Clean, fast, decisive. Not the way a person should handle something that affects other people's lives." "And now?" She looked at him. "Now I'm 30, and I've been in the chair for 3 years instead of 11 months, and I know what questions to ask." She turned a card, saw it was useless, set it face up. "I also know that knowing better after the fact doesn't undo anything. It just means you carry it differently." "How do you carry it?" The question sat between them. The fire made its sounds. Outside, somewhere down the mountain, there was the faint, distant rumble of what might have been a plow. "Badly some days," she said, and left it there. Bummed. The plow came through at 2:20. Mason heard it before he saw it. The grinding mechanical roar of the county equipment working its way up Route 9. the scrape of the blade on the road surface. He went to the door and looked out and watched it past the service track entrance, a yellow machine throwing snow in a high arc to the right shoulder, moving with the slow certainty of something that had a job to do and no particular feelings about it. He turned back inside. 20 minutes, we can move. She was already putting weight experimentally on the ankle, standing beside the chair with her jaw tight and her face doing the calculation. I can walk to the truck, she said. You can hop to the truck. Same thing. It's not... He stopped. Fine. Yes, we can go. He put the fire down carefully, damped the stove, made sure the last logs were reduced to coals that wouldn't spread, and secured the cabin the way he'd found it, boarding the window back up, replacing what little they'd used on the shelf. There was a logbook by the door, and he found a stub of pencil and wrote in it, "Sheltered here during storm, February 18th to 19th. Used some supplies. Left camp as found. M. Brooks." He thought for a second, then added, 2 of us. Then closed the logbook and left it where it was. Getting her to the truck was the same awkward, mismatched business as the previous night's walk in reverse. Her arm over his shoulders, his arm around her waist, both of them moving through snow that was knee-deep in places and deceptively crusted on top so that every third step one of them punched through to the soft layer underneath. She swore once, sharp and brief, when her left foot made unexpected contact with a buried rock. He tightened his arm instinctively and she steadied. "I've got you," he said. "I know." She said it without hesitation, which was different from last night, when the trust had been provisional and provisional had taken effort. He got her into the passenger seat, hit the dashboard panel, waited. The heater took 4 seconds longer than usual. "Come on," he muttered. It came on. He backed the truck down the service track carefully, feeling his way on the buried surface, and then they were on Route 9, and the plow had left a passable, if narrow lane going south, and he pulled into it and they moved. He drove. She sat. The mountains did what they did in the afternoon after a storm, which was to look extraordinary and not particularly apologetic about anything. They had been quiet for about 5 miles when she said, "I'm going to call my assistant when we get to where there's a signal. Tell her where I am." "Okay." "She'll have been trying to reach me since last night." "I figured." A pause. The road curved. He kept both hands on the wheel. "Mason." Her voice was different. He'd been learning her voice's registers over the past 18 hours. The professional one, the careful one, the one she used when she was actually thinking something through, and this one was none of those. It was quieter, less protected. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish it without interrupting." "Okay. What happened in this cabin?" She stopped. Started again. "What we talked about, what I told you." Another pause, and he had the impression of someone choosing every word with a kind of care that was not comfortable for them. "I don't do that. I want you to know that. I don't talk to people like that. I don't say the things I said, or I don't know where that came from." He kept his eyes on the road. "I think it came from you. I think you said true things because there was nothing to protect them with. That's..." She stopped again. "I was going to say unsettling, but that's not right." "What's right?" She was quiet for long enough that the road curved twice, and the first sign for Crestwood appeared at the edge of the tree line. 15 miles, blue and white, shot through with a rust stain from the bracket. "I don't know," she said, and then quietly, "That's the part I don't know." He didn't say anything. He let it be what it was without trying to label it, because the labels were all wrong anyway. Too small, or the wrong shape, or belonging to situations that were not this situation. The sign for Crestwood passed outside his window. She saw it. Her voice, when she spoke again, was back in the careful register. "I'll need a hotel, if there's one in town. There's the Ridgeline Inn, it's not much. That's fine. You also need a doctor to look at that ankle before you make any decisions about hotels. I'll decide that. I know you'll decide it. I'm telling you the sequence I'd recommend." He glanced at her. "You can ignore me." She looked out the window at the snow-covered fields, the bare trees, the first scattered buildings of the Crestwood outskirts beginning to appear. A gas station, a closed diner, a row of houses with smoke coming from their chimneys. "I won't ignore you," she said. Quote, the town looked the way it always looked after a serious storm, stunned and white and very quiet, like it was still taking inventory of itself. A few people were out on Main Street with shovels, clearing sidewalks. Hardin's Hardware had its lights on, which meant Bill Hardin had gotten in early to see what the storm had done, and was probably already behind the counter drinking terrible coffee and complaining about the county plows to whoever walked through the door. Mason drove past the store without stopping. He'd call Bill later. He took Claire to the Crestwood Urgent Care Clinic, which was in a low brick building on Archer Street that had been a veterinary office in a previous life, and still had the faint ghost of that purpose in its layout. The waiting room had 3 people in it: a teenager with a cloth wrapped around his hand, an older woman with a bag of frozen peas on her knee, and a man roughly Mason's age who was asleep in a chair with his mouth open and a neck brace on. Standard post-storm inventory. He sat in the waiting room while she was seen. He texted Linda from the first signal bar he'd gotten, 2 miles outside of Crestwood. Safe. Storm trapped me up the mountain. Coming back now. How's Ellie? Linda had texted back almost immediately, which meant she'd been watching her phone. Mason. She's fine. She cried a little last night but slept okay. She's having pancakes right now. Come when you can. Then 30 seconds later, she made me set a place at the table for you, just so you know. He read that twice and put his phone down and looked at the ceiling of the urgent care waiting room. A place at the table. He thought about the long night in the cabin, the cold, the fire, the way the conversation had moved from hostile to careful to honest to something that didn't have a clean category. He thought about Claire telling him, "I don't talk to people like that," with the look of someone who had just discovered something about themselves they weren't sure what to do with. He thought about his own chest, the small resistant shifting he'd felt when she said, "You are not nobody," the way he'd filed it away without examining it. He thought about Ellie setting a place at the table. He thought about what it meant to be the person someone set a place for. Claire came out of the back 20 minutes later on a pair of crutches that were slightly too tall for her, which gave her gait a particular lopsided quality. There was a fresh bandage on the forehead cut. The urgent care nurse had cleaned it properly. And the ankle had been wrapped in a compression bandage and confirmed, as Mason had assessed, to be a severe sprain rather than a fracture. She handed him back his jacket. He'd given it to her again in the parking lot before they went in. "Told you," he said. "You told me it was probably not broken," she said. "You didn't know for certain." "Close enough." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for bringing me here." "It's 12 blocks from the clinic to the Ridgeline Inn," he said. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." She looked at him for one more beat, then nodded. The Ridgeline Inn was a 12-room establishment run by a woman named Carol Briggs, who had been running it for 18 years and had developed, over those 18 years, a specific manner for greeting guests who arrived looking like they'd been through something. She took in Claire, the crutches, the bandaged forehead, the expensive but destroyed coat, the general appearance of someone who had passed through a significant event, and her expression did not flicker. "Room 1 is closest to the ground floor bathroom," Carol said, already reaching for the key. "Heat's good in that one. Ice machine is down the hall, but I'll bring you a bag personally, given the circumstances." "Thank you," Claire said. "You want me to call anyone?" "I have a phone. I'll handle it." Carol looked at Mason's, who was standing slightly behind Claire with the crutches he'd carried from the truck. He gave Carol a look that said, "Long night, don't ask." Carol gave him a look back that said, "I've seen longer." 20 years of running a rural inn had made her a master of the bilateral silent conversation. He carried the crutches up to room 1. Claire had no luggage. Her bag had presumably gone with the SUV. And so there was nothing else to carry, and the room was small enough that carrying the crutches took about 4 seconds. He leaned them against the wall by the bed. She stood in the center of the room looking at it. It was a plain room, a double bed with a blue coverlet, a small table, a window that looked out on the parking lot, a bathroom with a door that didn't quite close all the way. Carol kept it clean and warm. It was everything it needed to be and nothing it didn't. "It's fine," Claire said, partly to him and partly to herself. "I know." He stood with his hands in his pockets near the door. "Are you going to be all right?" She turned and looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time since the cliff, completely unmanaged. Not the assessment look, not the careful CEO look, not the trying to appear stronger than the situation look. Just her face, with whatever was actually on it, which was something he couldn't entirely name but could feel the weight of from across the room. "Probably," she said. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be." He nodded, put his hand on the door. "I need to go get my daughter." "I know." She didn't move. "Mason?" "Yeah." She opened her mouth and then closed it. Tried again. I don't know what this was, she said. I don't know what you call 20 hours in a cabin during a blizzard where you end up saying things you didn't know you were going to say. She paused. But I don't want to pretend it was nothing, just because it doesn't have a category. He stayed where he was, hand on the door, and let that land. It wasn't nothing, he said. No. I don't know what it was either. He looked at her directly. But I know what it wasn't, and what it wasn't is nothing. She held his gaze for a moment that had some actual weight to it. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. He opened the door. Get some rest. That ankle needs elevation. You keep telling me what the ankle needs. Someone has to. He almost smiled. She almost smiled. Neither of them made it all the way there. He left. Linda's house was 4 blocks from the Ridgeline Inn, a yellow clapboard with a covered porch and a wind chime that someone had made from old keys and that had been ringing in front of that house for as long as Mason could remember. He pulled into the driveway and he was barely out of the truck before the front door opened. Ellie came through it like something launched. She was wearing her pajamas, the ones with the small foxes on them, and her winter boots that she'd clearly jammed her feet into without untying them, and she crossed the porch and the 3 porch steps in what seemed like a single movement and hit him at roughly hip height, both arms going around him as far as they could reach, her face buried in his jacket. He caught her. He got both arms around her and lifted her and held on. She didn't say anything for a moment, just held on with the specific full-body grip of a child who has been worried about something for a long time and has finally gotten the thing she was worried about back in her hands. Hey, Bug, he said into her hair. You didn't call, she said, muffled against his jacket. Not accusing, just stating. I know, I'm sorry. No signal. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd clearly decided she was done with the crying part. But her face had that look, the specific look he hated seeing on it, the one that was too old for 6. The look that said, I knew something was wrong and I was right and it happened again. I'm fine, he said before she could ask. I got stuck in the storm up the mountain. I found a place to wait it out. I'm fine. She studied his face the way she always did when she was verifying this claim. A direct, serious, assessing look that reminded him, with a small jolt, of Claire's assessment look. The one she used to take people apart and put them back together. Different eyes, same mechanism. He didn't examine that similarity. You look tired, Ellie said. I am tired. And cold. Was cold, better now. She considered this evidence and apparently found it sufficient because something in her face relaxed. Linda made pancakes. I heard. Can I have some? They're probably cold now. I've been eating cold things for 20 hours. A cold pancake is fine. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he carried her up the porch steps. And Linda was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the expression she used when she was too relieved to be appropriately angry, which was the look of someone who loved you and was very tired of worrying about you. Mason Brooks, she said. I know, Linda. A text. That's what I got. I didn't have signal until... I know you didn't have signal. I'm just saying. She stepped back to let him through. Come eat the cold pancakes and tell me what happened. He ate the cold pancakes. They were in fact entirely cold, but they were good. Linda made them with vanilla and a touch of cinnamon. And he told Linda a version of the night that included the car crash, the cabin, the storm, and being stranded. He did not tell her who he'd been stranded with. He wasn't ready to have that conversation, and he wasn't sure why, but he honored the not readiness and said, A woman got hurt in the crash. We waited out the storm and left it there. Linda, who had known him for 12 years and was nobody's fool, looked at him with the particular expression of someone who was filing away several questions for later. But she didn't push, because she also knew that Mason didn't share things until he understood them himself, and pushing before then produced nothing but defensiveness. Ellie sat across from him at the table and ate a second pancake she'd been apparently saving, and told him about everything that had happened in his absence in the detailed, non-hierarchical way of small children, where the fact that she and Linda had watched a movie about penguins received the same weight as the fact that she had cried and not been able to sleep until Linda let her keep the hallway light on. He listened to all of it. He ate his cold pancakes. The kitchen was warm and it smelled like coffee and vanilla and the particular smell of Linda's house that had always meant safety. and Ellie was across the table from him with maple syrup on her chin talking about penguins, and the feeling in his chest was the complicated, full kind, the kind that happens when relief and something harder sit right next to each other. He thought about Claire in the Ridgeline Inn, alone in room 1, calling her assistant to reconstruct the logistics of her life. He thought about her saying, "I don't know what you call it, but I don't want to pretend it was nothing." He thought about how the two things, this kitchen, this girl, this maple syrup-smeared ordinary morning, and whatever had happened in that cabin, were not necessarily as incompatible as the voice in the back of his head kept insisting they were. That voice was cautious in the way that voices become cautious when they've watched the floor go out before. He recognized it. He wasn't going to argue with it, but he wasn't going to let it make all the decisions either. "Dad?" Ellie said. "Yeah, you went away somewhere." She was looking at him with the owl-eyed look. "In your head." "Sorry, Bug." Linda says when people go away in their head, it means they're thinking about something they need to figure out. He looked at Linda, who was very busy refilling her coffee and not making eye contact. "Linda is very wise," he said. "Did something happen when you were stuck?" He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, serious as a judge, waiting for the truth with the patience of someone who had learned that the truth eventually arrived if you waited long enough for it. "Something happened," he said. "Good. Something or bad something?" He thought about the cliff and the cold and the long night and the fire and the cards and the crackers and you are not nobody and the weight of a particular kind of honesty that happens when there's nothing left to protect. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Something in the middle, the kind that takes a while to understand." Ellie nodded slowly. This answer, apparently, was satisfying. She was used to things that took a while to understand. She went back to her pancake. He poured himself a cup of coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug, and the warmth of it spread into his palms, and he sat at Linda's kitchen table in the ordinary Tuesday morning aftermath of the worst blizzard in 3 years and tried to figure out what came next. He didn't get very far. But that was okay. Some things needed to be slept on before they could be properly thought about. And he hadn't slept, not really, not in almost 30 hours. He finished the coffee. He thanked Linda. He drove the 4 blocks home with Ellie buckled in the passenger seat, her hand tucked into his on the center console, her head turned to watch the snow-covered town pass by the window. At home, he made sure the pipes hadn't frozen and the heat was working and there was enough in the fridge for dinner. He pulled Ellie's boots off at the door, and she went to the couch and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes, one arm thrown over the back of it, one foot dangling, the fox pajamas twisted slightly at the waist. He put a blanket over her. He sat down in the chair across from the couch and looked at her for a minute. Then he got out his phone, opened his contacts, looked at the number he'd gotten from Carol at the front desk of the Ridgeline Inn on his way out, which he'd asked for under the guise of needing to follow up on the urgent care paperwork, and which was technically true. He didn't call. Not yet. He put the phone on the coffee table and closed his eyes, and was asleep in roughly 6 minutes. Whatever needed figuring out would still be there when he woke up. That was the nature of the things that mattered. They didn't go anywhere just because you closed your eyes. They waited. He slept for 4 hours and woke up to the sound of Ellie in the kitchen. Not a distressing sound. She wasn't hurt or scared. Just the specific small person in kitchen sounds of cabinet doors being opened and closed with insufficient attention to the closing part. The refrigerator seal releasing and resealing, the particular hollow knock of the plastic cereal bowl she always picked over the ceramic ones because she liked how light it was. He lay on the couch where he'd apparently migrated at some point from the chair, with the blanket that had been on Ellie now pulled over him instead, which meant she'd woken up first and covered him, which meant he was going to have to spend a few minutes being quietly undone about that before he was fit for conversation. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The afternoon light had changed. Later now. Closer to 4, maybe. The shadows in the room had the long quality of a winter afternoon running out of day. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see the edge of the counter and the small square of window above the sink, already going that dark blue that February afternoons went when the sun dropped behind the ridge. He thought about Claire. He'd been not thinking about Claire for the 4 hours he'd been asleep, and his brain, apparently rested enough to resume operations, had immediately queued her back up. The Ridgeline Inn, room 1, the crutches leaning against the wall, the look on her face when she'd said, "I don't want to pretend it was nothing." He sat up. "Dad's awake." Ellie announced from the kitchen, without looking around the doorway, in the tone of someone reporting a meteorological event. "Dad's awake," he confirmed. His voice had the rough quality of someone who'd been running on no sleep for too long and had finally gotten some. He rubbed his face with both hands. "What are you eating?" "Cereal." "Which cereal?" A pause. "The one with the bird on it." "That's my cereal, Ellie." "You were asleep. It needed someone to eat it." He couldn't argue with the logic. He got up, found his shoes by the door, where Ellie had apparently placed them at some point, aligned neatly, with a care that was so deliberate it had to be intentional, and went into the kitchen. She was at the table with the plastic bowl and a spoon that was marginally too large for her mouth, eating with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for him to wake up and now had things to discuss. She was still in the fox pajamas. Her hair was doing several different things simultaneously. He made coffee. He leaned against the counter and looked at his daughter and felt the specific weight of the past 36 hours settling around him like a coat you put on and suddenly realize is much heavier than when you took it off. "Are you hungry?" Ellie asked. "Yes." "There's eggs." "I see the eggs." "I was going to make them, but I didn't want to use the stove without asking." He looked at her. "When did you decide you needed to ask about the stove?" "Linda said I should ask before using the stove at someone else's house, and I figured probably also our house." "Linda's right," he said, "but also you're 6, and you shouldn't use the stove at all yet. I'll make the eggs." He made eggs. He made enough for both of them, because Ellie finished her cereal in approximately 40 seconds and looked at the pan in a way that made her interest obvious. They ate at the table together in the companionable way of people who had a long-established rhythm for sharing meals. And outside the window, the last of the February afternoon light gave up and went home. He hadn't looked at his phone since he woke up. He was aware of it in his jacket pocket. The jacket was hung by the door, with a specific nagging awareness. Not an emergency, just the presence of something unresolved. "Dad?" Ellie said. She'd been watching him again in the owl-eyed way. "The thing you said. Before. About something happening, the kind that takes a while to understand." "Yeah." She picked at the edge of her eggs. "Is it a person?" He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who had asked a reasonable question and was prepared to wait for a reasonable answer. He was going to have to stop being surprised that she was 6. "It's complicated," he said. "Because of work?" "No, not because of work. Because of something else." "Because of something else," he agreed. She went back to her eggs, apparently satisfied that she'd gotten what she came for. He watched her for a moment. Her easy acceptance of incomplete information, the way she filed it without needing the whole story, and thought about how children understood certain things more instinctively than adults, maybe because they hadn't yet accumulated all the noise that made instinct hard to hear. He cleared the plates. He washed up. He helped Ellie find her actual pajamas, not the fox ones, the ones she was supposed to sleep in, and he sat on the edge of her bed and read to her from the book about the talking rabbit that had been going on for weeks now, one chapter at a time. A rabbit with opinions about gardening and an ongoing feud with a neighboring hedgehog. She was asleep before the chapter ended. He closed the book, sat in the dark of her room for a minute, listening to her breathe. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, got his jacket from by the door, and got out his phone. He looked at Carol's number for the Ridgeline Inn. He put the phone back in his pocket. He put his jacket on. Then he took it off again and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. The thing was this. Whatever had happened in the cabin had happened in specific conditions that no longer existed. Cold and dark and fear and the stripped-down honesty of people who can't pretend because there's nothing left to pretend with. Those were conditions, not character. He'd known people who'd been through extreme things together and mistaken the intensity of the experience for something it wasn't. He'd seen it go wrong. The cabin had been real. Whether what happened in the cabin could survive in the actual shape of their lives was a different question, and it was a question he could not answer from his kitchen table, and he needed to stop trying. What he could say was, she was alone in a hotel room in a town she'd never spent time in, with a busted ankle and no luggage and a phone full of messages from people who needed things from her. He could say that. He could also say that the number in his pocket was not a romantic gesture. It was just a check-in, the kind of thing a person did when they'd been through something difficult with someone and wanted to make sure that someone was okay. He could say that and know it was partly true. He got his phone out and called the Ridgeline Inn. Carol picked up on the second ring. "Ridgeline Inn." Carol, it's Mason Brooks. I was in earlier. I know who you are, Mason. Room 1. If she's up, I just wanted... Hold on. He heard the click of hold. He waited. Through the kitchen window, the street was dark, and the snow under the streetlights had that blue-white quality it got at night when the temperature dropped back below 20. Mason! Her voice coming through the phone was different from the cabin. Slightly more contained, more the daytime voice, but not entirely. Hey, he said. I just wanted to make sure you were... I wanted to check in. A pause. I'm okay. She paused again. I've been on the phone for 3 hours. My assistant had to reroute my entire week. My board chair called twice. My lawyer called because apparently there's a protocol when the CEO is in a car accident and no one hears from her for 18 hours. That sounds exhausting. It was. He could hear her shifting, probably adjusting the ankle. My assistant is driving up tomorrow morning with a rental car and clothes and whatever else needs to happen. You have a place to stay. Until she gets here, yes. Carol seems determined to feed me. She sent soup to the room. That's Carol. She keeps looking at me like she's trying to figure out a puzzle. That's also Carol. A short sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh that didn't quite commit. How's Ellie? The question caught him slightly off guard, even though it shouldn't have. She's good. She's asleep. She covered me with a blanket while I was passed out on the couch. Silence on the line. The warm kind. Of course she did, Claire said quietly. Yeah. He turned his coffee mug in a circle on the table. Listen, I wanted to say something. Okay, what you said. In the car, and then at the hotel, about not wanting to pretend it was nothing. He stopped, organized his thoughts. I meant what I said back. It wasn't nothing. I don't know what it was, and I know our lives are about as different as 2 lives can be, and I know in 2 days you're going to be back in your world, and I'm going to be back in mine. Baan po zaita mas matiin. He paused. But I wanted to say that regardless of what any of that means, regardless of what comes from it or doesn't, what happened up there mattered. Not in a way I can explain cleanly, just in the way some things matter, and you know they do, and you don't need to have the explanation ready. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much. Then she said, I've been sitting here trying to write an email to my board chair explaining my whereabouts for the past 24 hours, and I cannot get past the 3rd sentence because I cannot make what happened fit into the language I normally use for things. Because it doesn't fit. Because it doesn't fit, she agreed. And that's... She stopped. I keep starting sentences I don't know how to finish. That's not something that happens to me. Maybe that's not a bad sign. It's extremely disorienting. Yeah. He almost smiled. I know. Another pause, then carefully, I meant what I said. About Crestwood. About the facility. Her voice had shifted back slightly toward the professional register, but not all the way. I want you to know that wasn't said in the cabin because I felt like I owed you something. It was said because I'd been thinking about it for a long time, and being up there made me stop hedging and just say the true thing. I know. How do you know? Because you told me self-deception has a bad yield. I don't think you were self-deceiving when you said it. A beat. You have a good memory. For things that matter, yeah. The line was quiet for a moment. Not awkward quiet, the other kind. Get some sleep, he said. Your ankle needs rest. You and the ankle, she said, and this time the laugh made it out, brief and real. Good night, Mason. Good night. He sat at the kitchen table after he hung up, with his hands wrapped around the coffee mug, and didn't try to think about what any of it meant. He'd done enough thinking for one day. Some things needed to be left alone in the dark to become what they were going to become without being interrogated about it. He went to bed. Chip. The next 3 days were the specific, ordinary, slightly altered kind of days that happen after something significant and before you know what it means. He went back to work on Wednesday. Bill Harden had opened the store at 7 despite the snow still being difficult on the side streets, because Bill Harden had opened the store at 7 for 30 years, and the habit was apparently stronger than blizzard conditions. When Mason walked in, Bill looked up from behind the counter, said, "You look terrible," poured him a cup of the terrible coffee from the machine that had been there since approximately 1987, and went back to the inventory he was doing. That was Bill's version of welcome back after a scare, and it was actually fine. The store had the particular post-storm energy of a hardware store in a small town. The phones had already started ringing with people who'd had pipes freeze, gutters collapse, roofs take damage. By 10 o'clock, there was a line of people needing advice on pipe insulation and roof jacks and the right kind of ice melt for different surface types. And Mason went into the work the way he always did, which was fully, without reserve, because when your job was helping people fix the actual immediate problems of their physical lives, there wasn't much room for being somewhere else in your head. But in the quiet moments, between customers, during lunch in the back room, on the drive home, he noticed that he was different in a way he couldn't measure precisely. Not happier, not sadder, more awake, maybe. More aware of the outline of things. He'd walk past the end of Main Street where the old plant building sat behind its fence, and he'd look at it with different eyes than he'd had 4 days ago. The building itself hadn't changed. It was still the same long, low structure with the empty parking lot and the weeds coming up through the asphalt in places, and the for lease signs that had been up for 2 years with no takers. But he looked at it and thought about what Claire had said, running the numbers at 3 in the morning, and found the thought sitting in his chest differently than cynicism usually sat. Not hope, exactly. He was too careful for the word hope in this context, but something adjacent to it. He texted her on Thursday morning. Not a long text, just, "How's the ankle?" She texted back 11 minutes later, swollen. "My assistant is horrified by my appearance. She keeps trying to get me to a specialist in the city. Listen to your assistant about the specialist. You sound like you're telling me what the ankle needs again." He put his phone in his pocket and felt something uncomplicated and good, which was a feeling he had a complicated relationship with because uncomplicated good things had historically had a way of becoming complicated in his life. But he let it be what it was. She texted again an hour later. "I'm going back today. Rental car. My assistant is driving." He read it during a lull between customers. "Safe drive," he typed back. "Thank you for everything." He looked at those 3 words for a moment. For everything. It was a complete sentence and also an incomplete one, the way some sentences are when they're standing in for a paragraph of things that would take too long to say. "You know where to find me if the Crestwood project becomes real," he typed. A longer pause this time. Then, "I'll be in touch." He pocketed the phone and helped a man in his 60s figure out why his basement sump pump had failed and what he needed to replace it, and the day went on. The way days went on, which was forward, whether or not you were ready for the direction. By Friday, he had fallen back into the full routine of his life with the efficiency of someone who had never fully left it. Work, Ellie's school, the drive through town, dinner at the table, the 2 of them, Ellie talking and him listening and asking questions and listening more. Dishes, homework. Ellie had a worksheet about animal habitats that required finding pictures in magazines, and they went through a stack of old National Geographics that had been in a box under the stairs for years, finding penguins and bears and brightly colored frogs that made Ellie genuinely delighted. It was a good Friday, the specific good of an ordinary life that was working, but something hummed beneath the surface of it, persistent as a frequency just at the edge of hearing. He was aware of the phone sitting on the counter. He was aware of the silence coming from it. He told her she knew where to find him, and she'd said she'd be in touch. And that was the whole of the architecture of what they'd left it at, which was, rationally, exactly the right architecture. They'd been through something strange and intense and honest, and they'd extracted themselves back into their separate lives. And the thing that had happened in the cabin could either become something, or it could remain what it already was. A real moment, honestly made, that had its own integrity, regardless of whether it led anywhere. He knew that. He believed it. He also knew that he'd checked his phone more times on Friday than he had any genuine reason to. Saturday was when it shifted. He was in the backyard with Ellie, mid-afternoon, engaged in the project of building what Ellie had described as a snow fortress, but which was in practice a low, uneven wall of packed snow with ambitions beyond its structural integrity. Ellie was an enthusiastic builder in the way that all 6-year-olds were enthusiastic builders. High vision, inconsistent execution, unshakable confidence in the outcome. She had a plan. The plan involved battlements. She was explaining the battlements to him in precise detail. He was listening and packing snow and thinking about nothing in particular when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost didn't check it. It was probably Bill with a question about an order, or Linda about the following week's pickup schedule for Ellie. He checked it. The number was not in his contacts, but the area code was from the city, and he knew before he opened it. "I've been sitting at my desk for the past 2 hours looking at the Crestwood file," it read. "I keep thinking about what you said, that if it's done, it needs to be done right, that the people there have already been burned and they won't forgive twice. I need someone who knows what done right actually means for this specific place. I know this is a lot to ask, and I understand if the answer is no, but I think that person is you." He read it twice. Ellie looked up from the battlement she was constructing. "Who's that?" "Someone from work," he said, which was not precisely true and not precisely false. "Important?" He looked at the phone, at the text, at the number and the area code from the city. "I think so," he said. "Are you going to answer?" He stood in his backyard with the snow up to the tops of his boots, and his daughter looking at him with the owl eyes and the particular patience that was her most consistent trait. And he thought about the cabin and the fire and the cards and the conversation in the car and the hotel room doorway and the phone call from his kitchen table. He thought about the plant building with the for lease sign and the 2 years of empty parking lot and Dennis Okafor in Cincinnati and Pete Solano looking 10 years older than he was. He thought about what it meant to be asked to help with something by the person whose decisions had caused the damage and whether the right response to that was suspicion or something harder and less satisfying than suspicion. He thought about what his father would have said, which was probably, figure out if it's real, and if it is, don't let the grudge sit in the driver's seat. He typed, "Tell me what you're thinking." The reply took 4 minutes, which meant she'd been composing it rather than just waiting. New facility. Different model from the old plant. Lighter manufacturing, cleaner processes, more sustainable. "I've been working with our development team on a preliminary plan for the past 2 days, and the numbers are more solid than I expected. We'd need community input at every stage, not just at the end. We'd need someone who could translate between the company's language and the town's reality, someone the town would actually trust." A pause in the messages, then, "I know what I'm asking. I know it's complicated. I just think it's the right thing to do, and I think you're the right person to help do it right." He read it standing in the snow with Ellie packing a new section of wall 6 feet away, humming something that was probably the Penguin movie soundtrack. He typed, "When do you want to talk?" "Monday?" "Monday," he replied. He pocketed the phone. "Is it handled?" Ellie asked, without looking up from the battlement. "Starting to be," he said. She nodded seriously, as though this was the answer she'd expected, and handed him a section of packed snow to add to the wall. Well, Sunday went by in the specific quiet of a Sunday in February in a small town, slow and gray and comfortable in the way that slow gray Sundays were, the kind that had nowhere to be and no apologies for it. He took Ellie to the diner for breakfast because the diner had been doing Sunday pancakes since before he was born, and the cook, a 60-year-old man named Gerald, who had the demeanor of someone who had been making pancakes for 40 years and knew that the work was sufficient, made them better than anywhere else Mason had ever been. They sat in the corner booth, the one by the window that looked out on Main Street, and Ellie had the silver dollar pancakes with strawberry syrup, and Mason had the regular stack with coffee, and they played the game they played at the diner, making up stories about the other people in the restaurant, giving them professions and histories and unlikely situations. Ellie had decided the woman in the red coat near the door was a marine biologist who was in Crestwood to investigate an unusual fish sighting in the river, which showed, Mason thought, a very specific imagination. He was on his second cup of coffee, and Ellie was deeply invested in the marine biologist's backstory when he looked out the window and saw something that made him set the cup down. Carol Briggs was walking past the diner on the opposite sidewalk, and she was not alone. Beside her, moving carefully on a single crutch, apparently the two had been reduced to one at some point over the past days, was Claire Whitmore, not in a rental car heading back to the city. Here, in Crestwood, on a Sunday. She was wearing different clothes than the destroyed outfit from the crash, jeans and a dark green jacket and boots. Practical ones this time, with the left boot looser than the right to accommodate the bandage. Carol was talking, gesturing at something up the street, and Claire was listening with the full attention listen that Mason had come to recognize as specific to her. He watched through the window for a moment, his coffee going warm in his hands. Ellie looked up from the marine biologist, looked at him, looked out the window. "Who's that?" she asked. He hesitated for half a second. "Someone I met last week." Ellie studied the two women on the sidewalk with the same analytical attention she applied to everything. Claire had stopped and was looking at something, The old plant building was visible from that end of Main Street, the long, low profile of it just visible over the rooftops. And even from across the street and through diner glass, Mason could see the quality of attention she was giving it. "She's looking at the factory," Ellie said. "Yeah." "Why?" "Because she's thinking about it." Ellie chewed a bite of pancake. "Is she going to do something about it?" He looked at his daughter, at the directness of the question, which cut clean to the middle of the thing without any of the complicated navigation he'd been doing around it all weekend. "I think she might try," he said. "Is that good?" "If she does it right." "How do you know if she'll do it right?" He watched Claire through the window. She'd turned away from the plant building now and was looking at something Carol was pointing to, a storefront that had been empty for 18 months, the kind of empty that had given up on even looking like it was waiting for a tenant. Claire's face was doing the thing, the assessment look, taking something apart to see how it worked. But it was aimed at the town now, not at him, and in the morning light he could see something in the quality of that look that was different from pure calculation, something that had more weight to it. "I think I'll know when I see it," he said. Ellie considered this for a moment. Then she said, "You should go say hi. I'm having breakfast with you. We're almost done. Gerald's going to bring the check." She looked at him steadily. "Go say hi, Dad." "Ellie, she's going to walk away and then you'll think about it all day." She pushed the last piece of pancake around in the syrup. "You did that with the dog at the shelter. You didn't say anything and we didn't get the dog, and you thought about it for a week. That's completely different." "Is it?" He looked at his 6-year-old daughter who was watching him with the owl eyes and the patience, and he thought about the dog at the shelter, a large, ungainly, one-eared mixed breed that had looked at him with a very specific kind of hope, and that they had not adopted, and that he had, in fact, thought about for longer than a week. He got up. "Finish your pancakes," he told her. "I'll be right back." He left a 20 on the table for Gerald and went to the door and out into the cold Main Street Sunday air. Claire saw him before he was all the way across the street. He could tell because she stopped mid-sentence. Carol was still talking, hadn't noticed him yet, and went still in the particular way she went still when she was taking something in and deciding what to do with it. He reached the sidewalk. Carol looked up, looked between them, did the bilateral silent conversation thing. "I'll just, she said, gesturing vaguely up the street. "Check on that thing. At the place." She walked away with the briskness of someone who had understood the assignment completely. Mason and Claire stood on the Main Street sidewalk in the Sunday cold with about 4 feet of salted pavement between them. "You're still here," he said. "I was going to leave yesterday," she said. "And then I didn't. Why not?" She looked down the street toward where the plant building was visible. "I wanted to walk around, see it, not from a car and not in a storm." She paused. "Carol offered to show me the town properly. Carol's been in this town for 40 years. She knows where everything used to be." That's what she kept saying. Her voice was careful, but not closed. Where it used to be and where it is now, and where the gap between those two things lives. She looked at him. "She told me about her daughter, who left for Nashville 3 years ago for work and hasn't come back." "I know Carol's daughter." "I know you do." She held his gaze. "I know you know everyone. I know this is your town in a way that it will never be anything to me except a thing I did, a harm I was responsible for." She said it directly, without performance. "I've been sitting with that since Friday. It's not comfortable." "It shouldn't be," he said, not unkindly. "No." She shifted her weight on the single crutch. "I texted you because I needed to. Because the file was there, and the numbers were real, and you were the name that kept coming up in my head when I asked myself who should be in the room when this gets made." She paused. "And also because I hadn't stopped thinking about the cabin." The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, someone was starting a car that needed a minute to warm up. "I thought you were going back," he said. "I was. What changed?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I realized I was going back because it was comfortable and familiar, and because going back was the option that didn't require me to figure out what any of this meant." She gestured slightly, a gesture that seemed to encompass the street, the town, him, the whole complicated situation. "And I've been trying to stop making decisions based on what's comfortable. Apparently I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm trying." He absorbed that. "You should have called," he said, "instead of just walking around with Carol." "I know. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. Because I didn't know what I'd say, and I've never been good at starting conversations I can't see the shape of. He thought about her in the cabin, saying, I need you to let me finish it without interrupting, the way she'd needed to get the architecture of her sentences straight before she could say the true thing. He thought about her playing out the solitaire game she knew she'd lose, because losing with full information was different from losing with incomplete information. I'm standing on the sidewalk, he said. You've got the floor. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes a smile by about 2 seconds in people who are fighting it. I want to do the project, she said. I want to reopen the facility, and I want to do it correctly. And I want you to help me do it because you're the person who knows what correctly actually looks like for this specific place. She paused. That part I could have said over the phone. But I also came back because the other thing. She looked at him with the kind of directness that had no social formula for softening it. I came back because whatever happened in that cabin, it happened to me, and not just to the situation. And I'm not sure what to do about it, but I know that going back to the city and filing it away and consonanting it to a category called extreme circumstances not applicable to real life would be wrong. Not strategically, just wrong. The car down the block finally caught and pulled out of its spot. Mason looked at Claire Whitmore on the sidewalk of his town's main street with the one crutch and the green jacket and the healed-over cut on her forehead, and he thought about what it cost a person like her to say the true thing in daylight without the dark and the cold and the stripped-down circumstances to give her cover. It cost something. He could see what it cost. Ellie's in the diner, he said. She blinked. Okay. She's finishing her pancakes. He paused. She's the one who told me to come out and say hi. Something crossed Claire's face that he'd have had to know her much longer to name correctly, but that had the quality of something landing somewhere it hadn't expected to go. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet, Claire said. She wants to meet you too, he said. She spotted you through the window and asked me 3 questions in about 12 seconds. What were the questions? Who you were, whether you were doing something about the factory, and whether you do it right. Claire was very still. What did you tell her? I told her you might try. And the last part? I told her I'd know when I saw it. She held his gaze. The Main Street Sunday quiet sat around them, the snow on the rooftops, the bare trees, the for lease signs, and the closed storefronts, and the diner with its lit window, and the small shape of Ellie visible through the glass, watching them with the owl eyes from the corner booth. Then I guess, Claire said carefully, you'd better keep watching. He looked at her for a moment, then he turned toward the diner door. Come have coffee, he said. Carol's going to find something else to do for a while. She came, and when he held the diner door open and she moved past him into the warm, pancake-scented interior, and Ellie looked up from the booth with the marine biologist forgotten and her eyes going wide and curious and completely unguarded, Mason felt it again, that small resistant shift in his chest, the one that had no clean name and didn't need one. Some things were just what they were. And what they were was enough to build on. The coffee at Gerald's Diner was not sophisticated coffee. It came in a thick ceramic mug that had been washed in industrial quantities for years and had the slightly blunt-edged quality of something that had survived a great deal of handling. It was hot, strong, and made no apologies for itself. Claire wrapped both hands around the mug the same way Mason had wrapped his hands around the cabin's water bottle 6 days ago, and she sat across from Ellie in the corner booth, and for a moment nobody said anything. Ellie was looking at her with the full, unfiltered attention of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude and has also not yet decided to care about that. Claire looked back. 2 people taking each other's measure, with no pretense about the fact that's what they were doing. You have a cut on your head, Ellie said. I do, Claire said. My dad fixed it. He did. Ellie looked at Mason, who was sliding into the booth beside her. You did a good job, she told him, with the gravity of a medical professional offering a professional assessment. Thank you, he said. Ellie looked back at Claire. Does it still hurt? A little, not as much. I had a cut on my chin last year. Dad used the same little strips. They work, but they itch. She tilted her head. Is your foot broken? Sprained. That's worse than broken sometimes. My teacher broke her wrist and she said a sprain her friend had was worse. Is yours worse? It's getting better. Ellie nodded, apparently satisfied with this update, and looked down at the remnants of her pancakes with the air of someone who had completed the intake portion of a meeting and was ready to move on to other business. Then she looked back up. "Are you going to fix the factory?" she asked. Mason said, "Ellie." "It's okay," Claire said. She looked at the 6-year-old across the table. The owl eyes, the fox pajamas under the open winter coat, the maple syrup that was still on her chin that nobody had addressed, and she said, "I'm going to try. It's hard and it might take a long time, and there are a lot of people who need to agree to it, but yes, I'm going to try." Ellie processed this with the solemn attention it deserved. "My friend Carly's dad lost his job at the factory," she said. "He drives really far now for work, and Carly says he's tired all the time." "I know," Claire said, quietly. "I know that happened to a lot of people. If you fix it, maybe he won't have to drive so far." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for." Ellie looked at her for one more moment. Then she picked up her fork and took the last piece of pancake. "Okay," she said, which was, apparently, her verdict. Gerald came by with the coffee pot and refilled Mason's mug without being asked, glanced at Claire's mug, refilled that too, and went back to the counter without a word. That was Gerald's version of welcome to Crestwood. The three of them sat in the corner booth while the Sunday diner moved around them, the couple in the middle booth arguing pleasantly about directions, the two old men at the counter who were there every Sunday as far back as Mason could remember, and who seemed to have a conversation that had been going on for approximately 20 years, the sound of the kitchen in the back doing kitchen things. Ordinary Sunday noise. The kind of noise that a town makes when it's still alive, even if it's tired. Mason watched Claire sit inside it. He watched her take it in. Not as data, not as market research, but just as the actual lived texture of a place. Gerald's bad coffee and the two bright overhead lights and Ellie stealing the unused creamer containers and stacking them into a small tower. Claire didn't perform comfort with any of it. She just sat with it, and slowly, across the 20 minutes they spent in that booth, the particular tightness she carried in her shoulders when she was in professional mode, loosened by some degree he couldn't measure exactly but could see. "Tell me about Monday," he said eventually. "The call. What does the actual plan look like?" She set her mug down. The CEO register came back up, but not all the way. It came up over something that was still present underneath it. "The development team has been working on a preliminary model. New facility, same site as the old plant. The infrastructure's already there, which saves significant capital costs. Lighter manufacturing than before. The old plant was heavy industrial, which is part of why it was losing money. The overhead for that kind of production in this region stopped making sense once the supply chain shifted." She paused. "The new model is precision components, smaller scale, higher margin, cleaner processes. Still real manufacturing jobs, not warehouse work or logistics, skilled work." "How many jobs?" "Phase 1, maybe 80. Phase 2, depending on performance, could be 150, 180. Not 412, but something." He held that number in his hands and turned it over. 80 was not nothing in a town of Crestwood's current size. 80 was Carly's dad not driving 3 hours a day. 80 was the diner having more customers on Monday mornings. 80 was not a full restoration of what had been lost, and he wasn't going to let himself pretend otherwise. But it was a real and specific beginning. "The community input," he said. "You said at every stage, not just the end." "I mean that. Public meetings. Actual listening, not the kind of public meeting where the decision is already made and you're just running out the clock on the comment period." She looked at him directly. "I know what that looks like. I've been in those meetings from the other side of the table. I won't run it that way. The people here have been in those meetings too, from the other side. I know. They'll be watching for it." "Good," she said. And the way she said it told him she meant it. Not as a talking point, but as someone who understood that being watched was appropriate and correct, given the history, and who was not looking for an easier situation, just a real one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a man named Ray DeLuca. He was a floor supervisor at the plant for 16 years. He's still in town. He's working part-time at the auto shop on County Road, but he's not. He's underemployed in a serious way, and he knows that operation inside out." He looked at her. "If you're serious about this being done right, Ray DeLuca should be in the room early, not as a symbolic gesture, as someone with actual decision-making authority over how the floor gets set up." She was writing something on her phone. "Ray DeLuca, floor supervisor 16 years. He's not going to trust you. Not at first. You should know that going in." "I'd be suspicious of anyone who did trust me at first," she said, "given the circumstances." Mason looked at her. She looked back. Something settled between them. Not agreement exactly, more like the specific alignment of two people who are starting to understand that they're working from compatible premises, even if they're coming from incompatible histories. Monday, he said. I'll be at Hardin's until 5. After that. After that, she confirmed. Ellie had finished her tower of creamer containers and was now looking between them with the expression of someone who had been following a conversation and had formed opinions about it. Is she going to come back? Ellie asked Mason. After Monday? He looked at Claire. Claire looked at Ellie with the full attention look. Yes, Claire said. I'm going to come back quite a lot, actually, if that's okay. Ellie considered this. Do you like grilled cheese? A beet. I do. We make them on Fridays. Dad cuts them into triangles. She looked at Mason. She could come on a Friday. Mason felt something happen in his chest that was not small and not resistant. He didn't look away from it this time. He let it be what it was. She could, he said. The Monday call lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Mason took it from the back room at Hardin's after his shift, sitting in the plastic chair that Bill kept back there for the purpose of sitting in while on the phone, with a notepad on his knee and a pen that kept skipping. Claire's development team was on the call. 2 people, a man named David, who spoke in the careful, precise language of someone who had learned to translate financial modeling into human sentences, and a woman named Priya, who asked better questions than anyone else on the call, including Mason, and who wrote things down constantly, which he respected. Claire ran the meeting the way he was coming to understand she ran everything, forward without wasted motion, but genuinely open at the pressure points. When he pushed back, on the timeline for community input, on the wage structure for Phase 1, on the question of whether the company would commit to local hiring preferences in writing rather than just a stated intent, she didn't deflect or soften the pushback. She engaged it. If it's not in writing, it's not a commitment, he said at one point. That's not me being difficult. That's me telling you what the people in this town will reasonably require after last time. A brief silence on the line. David, Claire said, add binding local hiring preference to the term sheet draft. Minimum 60% local workforce for Phase 1. We can negotiate the exact percentage, but the principle is non-negotiable. Got it, David said. Mason wrote on his notepad, binding, 60%, non-negotiable, and circled it. After the call ended, he sat in the back room for a few minutes, looking at the notepad. The pen skipping had meant some of his notes were partially illegible, and he went back through and filled in the gaps while the details were still fresh. The page was full. Not with promises, but with specific, debatable, writable down things, the kind of things that could be held accountable to. He was not going to be naive about this. He'd been around long enough to know that documents could be renegotiated, commitments could be watered down in implementation, good intentions in boardrooms could evaporate when the actual cost of them became clear. He was going to watch this the way he'd told Claire she should expect to be watched. He was going to hold the line on the things that mattered, and he was going to have conversations that were hard, and he was going to do it on behalf of people who had already given up something they shouldn't have had to give up. That was what being the right person for this meant. Not cheerleading, not being managed, doing the actual thing. He called Ray DeLuca that evening. Ray picked up on the third ring with the cautious energy of a man who had learned to be careful about unexpected calls. Yeah. Ray, it's Mason Brooks. Mason? The caution relaxed slightly. What's going on? I need to talk to you about something. About the plant site. He paused. There's a possibility, early stages, nothing guaranteed, of a new facility. Different operation than the old one. I've been in conversations with the company that owns the site. Silence on the line. Whitmore? Ray's voice had an edge like a blade that had been sharpened a few too many times. Yes. Mason, those people... I know, Ray. I know what they did. I was there. And I'm not asking you to forgive anything or trust anything yet. I'm asking you to have a conversation with me first, before you make a decision about whether to engage. He paused. Because if this is going to happen, and it's going to happen right, you need to be in the room where they're making the decisions. That's not a favor to them. That's protection for us. Long silence. What kind of operation? Ray asked, finally. Precision components, not heavy industrial, cleaner. Different skill set requirements, but transferable from what you already know. He paused. Phase 1 is about 80 jobs. 80, Ray said it flat, without inflection. 80 to start. Performance-based expansion. I know it's not what we had. No, it's not. Mason didn't dress it up. But it's 80 real jobs with real wages and a binding local hiring preference in the term sheet. And it's either 80 real things or the same empty building it's been for 2 years. He let that sit. I'm not telling you it's justice, Ray. I'm telling you it might be something. Another silence. This one felt different. Thinking quiet rather than resistant quiet. You'd be in the room? Ray asked. The whole time. And if it goes sideways, then we say so, publicly, on the record. That's part of what I negotiated. He looked at his notepad. They know I'll call it if it goes wrong. They accepted that condition. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Okay, I'll talk to you. Not to them, to you first. That's all I'm asking. And Mason, Ray's voice shifted. She's the one pushing this? Whitmore herself? Yes. Why? Mason thought about the cabin, the fire, the solitaire game, the conversation in the car. He thought about Claire on Main Street Sunday morning looking at the plant building with a look that had weight in it. Because she was 28 when she made the call, and she's 30 now, he said. And she's been carrying the gap between those two things. He paused. I don't know if that's enough reason to trust her, but I think it might be enough to talk to her. Ray exhaled. Coffee. This week. I'll set it up. He hung up and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen for a moment. Ellie was doing something involving construction paper in the living room, the specific sound of scissors and the satisfied ripping sound of tape being pulled off a roll. This was going to be long and difficult, and there were going to be meetings that went badly, and moments when the gap between what was promised and what was being delivered would need to be called out. And there were going to be people in Crestwood who saw the Whitmore name and decided before the first meeting that this was not something they could engage with. And some of those people would be right to feel that way, and their feeling deserved respect, not management. None of that changed what he'd decided. He got up and went to the living room. Ellie had made something. It appeared to be a castle constructed from construction paper and tape, and an ambition that slightly exceeded the structural properties of the materials. It keeps falling down on one side, she said, holding the problematic tower in place with one finger while she assessed the architecture. He sat on the floor beside her, looked at the castle. The base isn't wide enough on the left. You need more support before you keep building up. She looked at the base, looked at him. More support first, then up. Always. She got the tape and went back to work, reinforcing the left side with careful, deliberate strips. He watched her do it, the precision of it, the focus, the refusal to just hope the tower would hold without addressing what was actually wrong with it. More support first, then up. He thought that was probably the whole lesson, if he was looking for one. Claire came back to Crestwood 4 times in the month of March, not just for meetings. That was the thing Mason noticed and filed away without making a big deal of it. She came for the meetings. The first community meeting at the town hall, which had a turnout that suggested the entire population of Crestwood had decided to show up, and which had a temperature in the room that required careful management and honest answers. And at least 2 moments where Mason stepped in to translate between the company's careful language and the town's legitimate anger. Those moments were uncomfortable. Claire did not look for comfort in them. She sat in them and answered directly, and when she didn't have the answer, she said so, which was more disarming to a crowd expecting corporate deflection than any smooth answer would have been. But she also came on a Tuesday when there was no meeting scheduled, driving up from the city in the rental car that had become a familiar sight on Crestwood streets, and spent 3 hours walking the old plant site with Ray DeLuca and 2 of the other former workers who had agreed to be part of the planning group. Mason had set that meeting up, but he hadn't been there. He'd been at work. And what Ray reported back to him afterward was not a ringing endorsement, but was something more durable than one. She listens and she writes things down, and she doesn't argue when I tell her something doesn't work. She asks why instead. That's different from what I expected. Coming from Ray DeLuca, that was a significant data point. She came on a Friday in the 3rd week of March. That one she'd told him about in advance in a text that was brief and had the quality of someone not making a bigger deal of it than it was. In Crestwood Friday. Paperwork with the county office in the morning, afternoon free if you want to walk the site. He'd texted back, Ellie's got a half day. She'll be home by noon. Come for grilled cheese at 1. A pause. Then, I'll be there. He cut them into triangles. He did this deliberately, and he watched Ellie watch him do it, and Ellie's expression said she understood the significance of this without needing it explained, because she was the one who had issued the invitation in the first place. Claire arrived at 1:05 in the green jacket and the practical boots, carrying a small bag that turned out to contain, when Ellie investigated it with the thoroughness of a customs agent, a used copy of a book about a girl who builds robots, which Claire had found at a used bookstore in the city and had bought on the basis of a conversation she'd had with Ellie at the diner about what Ellie wanted to be when she grew up. Ellie had told her that Sunday at Gerald's that she was considering either a marine biologist or a person who builds things. Claire had apparently taken this seriously enough to remember it 3 weeks later, which Ellie absorbed with a quiet intensity that Mason recognized as the sign of something landing deep rather than shallow. They ate grilled cheese at the kitchen table. Ellie's was cut into 4 triangles, and she ate them in a specific order that she had a system for that Mason had long ago stopped trying to understand. Claire's was cut into 2 triangles, and she ate them without a system, which Ellie noted but chose not to comment on, which was its own form of acceptance. The conversation at the table was the kind that happened when a child was present, routed through Ellie's interests, her questions, her non-hierarchical way of moving from the book about robots to a question about whether fish could get cold in winter, to an inquiry about what Claire's office looked like, to a declaration about a disagreement she'd had with a boy in her class named Tyler, who had claimed that triangles were not the best shape, which was wrong. "What's the best shape?" Claire asked. "Triangles," Ellie said, with finality. "They're the strongest. You can't squish a triangle." "That's structurally accurate," Claire said. "Triangles distribute force better than other shapes." Ellie pointed at her grilled cheese. "That's why." "That's why," Claire agreed. Mason ate a sandwich and watched this exchange, and felt the particular fullness of that feeling again. The complicated, not small kind. The kind that came from watching two people find a language with each other that worked. After lunch, while Ellie went to her room to read the robot book, Mason and Claire sat at the kitchen table with the second round of coffee, and the conversation shifted. "The county signed off on the preliminary permits this morning," she said. "I heard. David texted me. The board approved Phase 1 funding last week." She turned the mug. "It's real. We're past the point where it was just something I was planning." "I know." He looked at her. "Ray told me about the Tuesday walkthrough. He's going to be a difficult partner. He's going to be an honest partner. Those are the same thing for the first year." She almost smiled. "I know. I'm not complaining." She paused. "The first community meeting was harder than I expected." "Did you expect it to be easy?" "No, but expecting something to be hard and then it actually being that hard are different experiences." "There was a woman in the back row," he said. "Third meeting, blue coat. She didn't speak, but she had a look on her face that I was watching for." "I saw her. That's Sandra Okafor, Dennis's wife. Dennis is the man who moved to Cincinnati after the closure." He held Claire's gaze. "She came to all 3 meetings and didn't say a word. That means she's watching. It means she hasn't decided yet." "What do I need to do to help her decide?" "Nothing. You can't manage her toward a conclusion. You just have to keep doing it right and let the evidence accumulate." He paused. "The thing about trust in a town that's been burned is that it doesn't come from a meeting or a gesture or a statement. It comes from the gap between what you said you'd do and what you actually did, over time. There's no shortcut." She looked at him steadily. "I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway because I'll need to keep saying it when the board is pushing for a faster timeline, or when the PR team wants to run a Whitmore Gives Back campaign and you need someone in the room saying, 'Not like that.' Is that your formal job description?" "It's the only version of this I'm doing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like it in writing." He looked at her. "Consultant, community liaison, whatever we call it." She was serious. "Real pay, real title. Not a favor. A role. You've been doing this work for the past month without any formal structure, and that's not right." He started to say something about the hardware store, about Bill Harden, about the logistics of it. "Part-time to start," she said, before he got there. "You don't have to leave anything, but what you're doing has value, and I'm not comfortable with the current arrangement where you're doing it out of," she paused, searching for the right word, "personal investment." "What if I want to do it out of personal investment?" "Then you can also do it out of professional obligation. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He looked at his coffee mug. He thought about the plant building and Ray DeLuca and Sandra Okafor in the blue coat watching from the back row. He thought about 80 jobs becoming 150, becoming something that actually shifted the direction of the town's slow, tired aging. "I'll talk to Bill," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not." Something relaxed in her face. Not relief exactly. She didn't perform relief. She wasn't built that way. But the absence of tension that had been there. "There's something else," she said. "Okay." She turned the mug again. It was a habit he'd noticed. The turning of whatever she was holding when she was preparing to say something she wasn't sure how to start. He'd noticed it in the cabin with the water bottle. He'd noticed it on the phone the first night. He noticed it now. "I've been making decisions based on comfortable and familiar for a long time," she said, "and I told you I was trying to stop doing that. That's still true." She looked at him directly. "The project is real and it's separate from the other thing. I want you to know those are separate. I'm not here on Fridays because of the project." The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay on the table between them. Somewhere in the house, Ellie had started reading aloud to herself from the robot book, the specific mumbled but animated sound of a child doing the voice of a character. "I know they're separate," he said. "I need you to be sure, because the project is a thing I'm asking you to do. And the other thing is—" She stopped. "The other thing is a thing I'm asking for myself, and I want to be clear about the difference." He looked at her for a long moment. The woman who had been in his truck in a blizzard, and on the cliff face in the dark, and in the firelight of the cabin with the stripped-down honesty of someone who had nothing left to protect herself with. The woman who had played out a losing solitaire game to the end because losing with full information was different. The woman who had come back to a town she had damaged, not just to repair the damage, but because she didn't want to pretend that something which wasn't nothing was nothing. "Claire," he said. "Yes. I know the difference." She was still for a moment, then she nodded, once the way she nodded when she'd received information she'd verified and filed. From Ellie's room came the robot girl's voice, animated and slightly ridiculous, making the sound of something being built. The groundbreaking for the Crestwood Precision facility happened on a Tuesday in the second week of April, when the snow had finally retreated from the lower mountain slopes and the mud season had started making everything difficult in the pragmatic way it always did in this part of the state. There was no red ribbon. Claire had vetoed the red ribbon specifically. "It looks like we're celebrating ourselves," she'd told the PR team, "and that's not what this is." And so instead there was just a gathering of people on the site of the old plant, with folding chairs set up on the asphalt and a portable heater that worked intermittently, and Claire at a microphone stand saying words that Mason had helped her workshop for 2 weeks. The words were not polished. That had been part of the workshopping. The first draft had been too polished, too lawyered, too careful in the way of a public statement written to minimize liability. He'd sat across from her at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with a red pen, an actual red pen, which had made her raise an eyebrow, and gone through it line by line. "This sentence," he'd said, pointing, "the one about acknowledging past challenges in the transition of regional employment infrastructure. What does that mean in a language people actually speak? It means we closed the plant and it hurt people. Then say that. My lawyer is going to—" "Your lawyer is not standing on that asphalt in April talking to people who lost their jobs. You are." He'd put the pen down. "You told me you wanted to do this right. This is what right looks like. It looks like saying the true thing even when it's uncomfortable." She'd looked at the draft. She'd picked up her own pen. She'd crossed out the sentence and written above it, in her small, precise handwriting. 2 years ago, decisions made by my company cost this town 400 jobs and the security that came with them. That was real damage to real people, and I'm going to spend the next several years trying to demonstrate that I understand the weight of that. He'd read it. That's better. It's terrifying to say out loud. Yeah, that's how you know it's honest. She'd said it out loud on that Tuesday in April, standing at the microphone in the April mud with the folding chairs full of Crestwood people. Some skeptical, some cautiously watchful, some who had come because they needed to see for themselves that it was real. Sandra Okafor was in the 4th row. Ray DeLuca was standing at the back with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing easily readable, which Mason had come to understand was Ray's version of engaged attention. When Claire said the true thing about the 400 jobs and the weight of it, the crowd didn't applaud. That would have been the wrong response anyway. What happened was a particular quality of silence. the kind that meant people were sitting with something rather than dismissing it. Mason, standing to the side, watched the room and took its temperature and thought, this is the beginning of something, not the end of something hard. The beginning of something that will require a long time and consistent effort and a lot of difficult conversations and no red ribbon, but a beginning. After the event, when the chairs were being folded and people were standing in small groups in the way of events that had gone well enough that people wanted to keep standing in proximity to each other, Ray DeLuca walked over to where Claire was talking to the county zoning officer. He waited until the zoning officer moved on. Then he extended his hand. Claire shook it. No words, just the handshake, and Ray's face doing the thing it did when he'd assessed something and arrived at a provisional judgment. He nodded once. She nodded back. He walked away. Mason, watching from 8 feet away, thought, that's the one that matters. Not the paperwork, not the permits, not the board approval. That handshake, from a man who had every reason to not offer it, from a man who had weighed the evidence and decided it was sufficient for now, for this, that was the thing that meant they had a chance. 3 weeks after the groundbreaking on a Friday evening, Mason came home from Hardin's, where he now worked 3 days a week instead of 5, Bill having agreed to the reduced schedule with the specific graciousness of a man who was proud of the person he was letting go part-time, to find Claire's rental car in the driveway. She had a key. He'd given her one 2 weeks ago, the giving of which had been its own small conversation, brief and honest, the way their conversations tended to be. He went inside. The smell hit him before he saw anything. Grilled cheese, which was correct for Friday, but also something else. Tomato soup. From scratch by the smell of it. Which meant she'd been there long enough to make tomato soup from scratch, which was not a quick undertaking. He stood in the hallway and just took that in for a moment. From the kitchen came Ellie's voice. Dad's home, and then Claire's voice. I heard the door. He always takes his boots off first and then his jacket, Ellie said. In that order, always. Good to know, Claire said. He took his boots off, then his jacket. He went to the kitchen doorway. Ellie was at the table with the robot book and a glass of juice. Claire was at the stove with a wooden spoon and a cooking posture that suggested she was taking the soup seriously. She'd put her hair up, practically, not elegantly, and she was wearing the dark green jacket over a plain shirt, and she looked like someone who was exactly where they'd chosen to be. She looked at him over her shoulder. You look like you need to sit down. Long day. Sit down. It's almost ready. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Ellie. Ellie looked up from the robot book with the owl eyes. She makes really good soup, Ellie said, with the tone of someone sharing an important piece of intelligence. Yeah? Better than the canned kind. High praise. Ellie went back to the book. He watched Claire at the stove, stirring the soup with the same focused attention she brought to everything. And he thought about the night on the cliff and the cabin and the fire and the cold beans and the crackers and the long dark hours of honesty and everything that had accumulated since then. The meetings and the difficult conversations and the red pen on the draft speech and the key on the hook and the tomato soup on a Friday. None of it was smooth. None of it was the kind of story you could make fit neatly into the shape of a story. There were still people in Crestwood who didn't trust this and might not, ever. Ray DeLuca still had days when his jaw was set and his eyes were measuring, and the provisional judgment could feel like it was under review. The board still pushed back, sometimes hard, on the timeline and the costs, and Mason still had to be the difficult person in those calls, the one who said, "That's not what we agreed," and made it stick. Claire still had the 1,000-mile distance of the city in her sometimes, the professional shell that went up when she was tired or overwhelmed or in a room full of people from her other life. And those were the times she had to consciously choose to come back out of it. And not all of those moments were graceful. And there were things between them that were still being figured out. Big things. The distance between their two lives was real and required real decisions that they hadn't all made yet. The conversation about what this looked like long term, what it meant for Ellie, what it meant for Claire's work, what it meant for Mason's place in something that was partly his community and partly his livelihood and partly his heart. That conversation was ongoing. It would probably be ongoing for a long time, but ongoing was not broken. Ongoing was the work. And Mason had learned, in the 3 years since the floor went out from under his life, that the work was the point. Not the destination, not the neat resolution, the actual daily effort of building something with inadequate materials and imperfect conditions, getting the base right before you built up, reinforcing the side that kept falling, trying again when it came down. Claire brought 2 bowls to the table, set one in front of him, one at the seat she'd been using, which was the seat across from Ellie and to Mason's left. She went back and got Ellie a smaller bowl. Ellie's soup, he noticed, had the pieces of tomato strained out of it, which meant at some point in the afternoon Ellie had communicated her preferences and Claire had adjusted, and then sat down. 3 bowls, 3 people at the kitchen table. Ellie looked at her soup and then looked at Claire. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Claire said. "Do you like it here? In Crestwood?" A pause. Claire considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected, which is different from what I came here for, but better." Ellie nodded. "Linda says some things are better when you find them by accident." Linda sounds wise. "She also says my dad needs someone to tell him to sleep more." Ellie said this with the matter-of-fact quality of someone delivering a message she'd been asked to deliver, or possibly one she'd decided to deliver on her own initiative. Mason looked at his daughter. "She said that specifically?" he said. "She implied it strongly," Ellie said. Claire was looking at her soup with an expression that suggested she was working hard not to smile. "Eat your soup," Mason told Ellie. Ellie ate her soup. Outside, the April evening was doing what April evenings in this part of the country did, cooling fast once the sun went down, the sky going that particular clear dark that came when the cloud cover had finally moved through and left the stars accessible for the first time in days. The key on the hook by the door caught the kitchen light in a small glint. The heat was working without needing the dashboard panel, because this was a house, not a truck, and some things worked the way they were supposed to. Not everything, not most things, but some things. And that was enough. Mason ate his soup. It was, in fact, better than the canned kind. He thought about telling her that, but decided she probably knew, because she'd made it and she paid attention, and she would have tasted it before she served it. She didn't need the validation. She needed the soup to be eaten in the presence of people who were glad it existed, which was a different thing. He ate it. He looked at his daughter reading the robot book with one hand and eating soup with the other, and across the table at the woman who had come back to a town she'd hurt, because the true version of herself was more uncomfortable than the comfortable version, and because some things that happened in a blizzard in a mountain cabin were real enough to build a life around, even if the building was slow and imperfect and ongoing. He thought about what the storm had cost and what it had given, and how those two things sat side by side without canceling each other out. He thought about the 412 people, and the 80 and the 150, and the long work of making something true out of something broken. He thought about Ellie setting a place at the table. He thought about a man who stops in a blizzard because of what he'd want someone to do, if it were him down there, and how that single, unglamorous, entirely ordinary act of human decency had set everything in motion. Not cleanly, not without consequence, not in a way that wrapped up neatly, but in motion. That was the thing, maybe. Not that doing the right thing led to good outcomes in any guaranteed way. Not that kindness was its own reward in the tidy sense of the phrase, but that doing the right thing kept you in the stream of actual living, the part where things happened and people changed and towns fought to stay alive and children set places at tables for people who were coming home. The part where the work was real and the people were real and the soup was better than the canned kind. Mason Brooks set down his spoon and looked at his life and found it sufficient. More than sufficient. It wasn't finished. It wasn't perfect. Half of it was still under construction, and the other half had cracks that would need ongoing attention, and there was probably a section of the foundation that would need to be looked at seriously in the next year or so. But the base was wide enough now, and they were building up,